trying to remember the plot of this book. After all these years. So the book starts with a group of people meeting each other, and it's a random prologue that's just the main characters bumping into themselves on the highway to spring break, and it takes place like 5 years before the story. It just shows that they met one time. It kind of establishes a little bit of where they're at. And so then the story kind of picks up with the three main characters, which one is like this hillbilly kind of farm guy, the other is this mechanic kid, and then this girl who's just graduated high school is kind of getting ready for college. And I think the girl just kind of showing she's a daredevil. She wants to like jump off this bridge that's kind of the senior tradition, but it's dangerous. So she's doing that, and the farmer's just kind of taking care of his old farmhouse, and then the mechanic kid is going to mechanic school and then taking care of his mom at night. And he gets in a fight with his stepdad, and they get in a physical fight. And he has a best friend who works with him, so he's kind of just being a mechanic. So then, one day, a video goes viral, and it's of this guy who sees his son who passed away the week before, like the night after his funeral. The son got sick and died, and that night, the son shows up at his house standing outside the dad's window, and then the son's like, "Can I come in?" And the dad's like, "Well, yeah." So the son dives through the window and texts the dad, and they're like, this is the footage they have. It went, like, they're both missing. Like, after they fall in the house, no one's seen either of them again. And they're like, but the funny thing is, there's 3 different camera angles, and only one camera shows the kid, even though they're all filming that location. And in 2 of the videos, the dad is just talking to a glass window, and they're like, but there's a 3rd camera. You can actually see his son standing there. And they're like, that camera was filmed without, it's a mirrorless camera. They're like, all the mirrored cameras, the kid doesn't show up. And so they're like, is it doctored or whatever? It's kind of viral. So then, I think the farmer guy, his dog in the middle of the night starts barking and then yelps. And then he goes out looking for his dog, and the dog's off the chain, and there's like a blood trail, and he follows it out in the cornfield, and he just finds his dog has been just like killed. And so he's all distraught, buries his dog, and he kind of like arms himself up for like whatever coyote's happening, and the police show up the next day to say that's not the only animal incident that's happened. And meanwhile, the main character, the boy, I think the main character boy is kind of the main character, like more so than the others, in my personal opinion. But maybe that's just because I see myself more in that character. So he's doing his mechanic thing, kind of estranged from his parents for a little while after the fight. And he sees on Facebook that there's like a bunch of people on the East Coast, like right here. right here. That there's an epidemic of people robbing nursing homes, robbing funeral homes of their bodies. So people will come in the morning and all the bodies will be gone. And they're confused, but there's all these conspiracy theories as to what's going on. And a lot of people think that there's a disease because the people who die are sick first. So they think there's people breaking in and burning the bodies at night or taking them away so that the disease doesn't spread. And there's a theory it's kind of a cover-up and trying to keep people from panicking. I think it says like an Ebola outbreak, because this was before COVID. This is like this mysterious disease sweeping the East Coast, bodies disappearing. So he's doing his mechanic thing. And meanwhile, the girl, she heads with a girlfriend to Manhattan for kind of not a spring break, but one last kind of having fun before they go off to college. So they head to Manhattan. And so, let's see. The bodies disappear more. I think she's the one who goes on Facebook. And the next night when she's in Manhattan, it's just really weird. And they kind of go and party in Manhattan that night. And when they wake up in the morning, there's not a lot of people there. And it's just like the streets seem a little bit more empty in Manhattan. And it's kind of weird. She's uneasy. People are starting to talk about what's going on, wondering, where all the bodies are going. And then the boy kind of sees a military presence starting to build up, and the farmer's just trying to figure out what's going on. So there's one night where all the speculation comes to the head in this book, and it's a fun chapter, and I based it off of this chapter in The Stand, where Stephen King writes about all these different encounters that in that book there's a disease called Captain Trips, and the disease is Captain Trips, and it's all the people that make contact. So it's like this police officer wrote this guy a ticket who sneezed, and the police officer went and arrested 3 more people and gave it to all 3 people. One of those people got his lawyer to let him out, and on the way out he got his lawyer sick, and then he went and bought ice cream and got everyone in the ice cream shop sick. And it just kind of is this whole chapter dedicated to just not following a specific character, but following the disease as it spreads through all these people. And I was like, that was just a cool chapter, just a cool way to do it. So I did this one chapter where it was like, this is the moment where the vampires are going to come out of hiding. Like, they can't hide it anymore. And so basically in the middle of New York Stadium, in the middle of the night, or in the middle of a baseball game, like 10 vampires just hop over the back fence and start attacking the baseball players in the middle of a baseball game. And then like a bunch go into the crowd. So like the crowd's going crazy, and like security's running out, because like the baseball players run and security runs out the other way. But then the security gets killed, and then everyone's screaming and running and hiding. And then the girls in Manhattan turns into chaos and all this stuff's going on. But that chapter before, it just shows like all these different incidents all across the East Coast of vampire attacks, and them like blatantly come out, and how it's just reached this peak of spreading up and down the coast. And it just kind of like jumps from vampire attack to vampire attack. And then it jumps to the girl and her in Manhattan, and how they're at a party, and how this guy just like walks into their apartment, and they're like confused, but then the guy like bites someone and like kills them, and they're like freaking out, and like the girls dive under a couch and they're hiding as the party's screaming. And then she eventually like runs out and hides in a janitor's closet, and just kind of like is just huddled with like a broom in the janitor's closet until morning. And then the boy, the like 20-year-old boy, he is just at home in his like small town trying to figure out what's going on. And he sees his mom at the window, and I think his mom was sick or something. And all of a sudden he sees his mom like standing outside his window on his second story, like on the roof, like saying, "Let me in." And he's like confused. And then his buddy who's spending the night with him, because they're uneasy, that's why he's there, he yanks him into the hallway, and they're like, he's like, "Don't go out there like it's a vampire, dude," or whatever. And I don't know how much they know at this point, but they're like, "Let's just stay in the hallway, don't go to any external windows." So they're huddled. Meanwhile, the old farmer guy, he's not like farmer, he's like 45. He has like been kind of tracking and trying to hunt this thing that killed his dog, and it shows up on his porch, and he has his buddy, because they think they don't know what's going on, so he has his buddy come over, and they're kind of armed up and just like watching, trying to like staying up through the night, trying to figure out who's coming on his property. And so they spot this vampire, and they get into this big shootout on the porch, but this vampire just won't die. It just keeps coming and coming and coming. And as they're just unloading, and then finally they get it to drop, and he takes a shovel and chops the vampire's head off. And then he sees all these worms just wiggling towards each other as the head's trying to reconnect to the body. So he like kicks the head away, and he's like, "What is going on?" So then in the morning, the main character girl, she ends up in a janitor's closet, and she comes out, and the city is kind of barren. She can't find her girlfriend, and she ends up finding just a random group of like 20 people who are just coming out to the streets by themselves, and it's the middle of an empty Manhattan, like, what happened? All confused, and they're like, "We got to get out of here." So they start heading to walk out of Manhattan, or maybe get in a car and trying to drive out. And then the boy, I think he wakes up either that night or the next night, and the streets of his town go into martial law lockdown, and the military's roaming the streets. So he goes out in the morning, it's really foggy, and he can see an army tank just kind of sitting in the road up ahead. And so he walks over to kind of go see what's going on, because it's so still and quiet, it's not moving where they were marching the day before. He walks over, and it's just an empty army tank just sitting there, and there's like a military helmet with blood on it, and then just like rifles sitting on the ground, and pieces of clothing and stuff, but no people, no military guys anywhere. So they're like, okay, like what is going on? So then they get an evacuation notice, and there's a lot missing. This is let's see what I can remember. So somehow everyone kind of starts moving west. Like the whole East Coast is kind of evacuated, and all the characters are trying to travel west to get away from the East Coast, which is basically just under chaos. And there's these safe zones, and they have designated areas to go to depending on their address and who they are. So that way the government's trying to like safely evacuate people into safe zones. So they've designated these schools. Oh my gosh, I forgot. In California on the far coast, somewhere around here, maybe Arizona, there's a military base where turns out they captured the dad from the beginning of the video, and they have that dad or either the son, and they have him contained in the basement, and they're studying him, and they're trying to figure out. So they've kind of known what was going on, and there's a character who his job is to study and like figure out his weaknesses. So he's testing it, and he sees that like their holy water will burn them, garlic, hurt, like all the things that hurt vampires. He's kind of testing these things and finding out what will hurt them and what won't. And then they're sending that information back to the rest of the world to try and help them fight. So then somehow all the characters end up at a school, And this school has been outfitted by the military with UV lights. So all the lights in the whole school are all now UV, and they're on all night. And so they're like, the main characters are kind of trying to sleep, but it's under this bright light, and the whole thing is run off a huge generator. But the point is they're trying to keep everyone safe. So there's all these little areas like schools and stuff that have been designated these safe zones. And so all the characters kind of happen to just by coincidence go to this one safe zone. And so they're in there and everyone's telling their stories. And the hillbilly guy, the farmer, he's got just a milk jug that he has blessed by a priest. So he has just a jug of holy water, and like he's trying to arm up with all these special weapons. And the young kid's best friend was bitten one of the nights on the hand, so he's kind of getting sicker and sicker, and they kind of know what's going on. And so then randomly in the middle of the night in this school just filled with people, they're all like in cots in the gymnasium, and they all have these sheets that they put over themselves so they can try and get sleep under the lights. All of a sudden the lights go out, and so the main character, they all kind of get up, and they've been talking together, so they get up together as all of a sudden the windows start getting broken in, and all of a sudden there's screams and chaos as the building comes under attack. And everyone's there's guns going off, but it's dark, they can only see in the gun flashes. And the farmer guy is kind of telling the group, the girl and the boy, like, there's a generator, we have to get to that generator and turn it back on. For some reason it's off, we have to like go check that maybe, as everyone else is fighting. So I remember the character's running and he has his holy water, and a vampire turns a corner and he hits it, and they go chest to chest with the holy water in between them, and it smashes, and the holy water just goes poof and douses them both. But then it like hurts the vampire and like melts its face. So the vampire falls and he continues. And so they discover that there's this lady who's a familiar, who she's like been hypnotized, and she's like a pet of the vampires, who shut off the generator. So they get the generator back on, and all the vampires caught in the middle of the school kind of burn up under the light, but a couple dive out the window and get out. But then, you know, a few of the people are left, and that's when his friend gets bit. That's where he gets bit. So then they decide that the school is too dangerous the next morning. And so a lot of people want to stay, a lot of people want to leave, they don't want to risk it again. And so it's kind of split, but the main characters decide to leave together and keep heading west. So meanwhile, as they're doing this and going further, they have one night, something happens at like a storage facility where they realize someone in their group, because they go with like 10 people, they realize one of the people in the group was the familiar that shut off the generator. So they kind of get rid of her, like basically leave her behind for the vampires. I think they lock her in a storage facility, and they get on a boat, and then they get chased by vampires on a boat out in the water, and the vampires are swimming really fast, and they all got guns, and as the vampires try to climb up their boat, they're shooting them off. And so there's some exciting night with that. And a lot of that survival is their group keeps getting dwindled as they keep trying to find a safe spot to go. So then meanwhile, the military base runs a test on the vampire they have, and they take him to the surface, and they realize he's trying to send out a signal. So they take him to the surface after realizing he's putting off this signal. And on the surface, they catch this more powerful signal, and then like the thrashing vampire's like attitude changes as soon as the outside signal hits him. So they more or less come to the conclusion that there's something controlling them all. So they run kind of So in order to triangulate where the signal is coming that's controlling the vampire, that's why they have to take him to the surface. But the payoff is, as soon as they take this vampire to the surface, all the other vampires are most likely, they figure, gonna know where they're at. And so they take this thing to the surface and they triangulate the signal to the White House. But then they see, like, by every trackable measure, they're like, every vampire just turned in this direction. And so he goes down and the base is being overrun, and they go back down on the ground and tie up this vampire. And then he goes and sends a signal out to all the rest of the United States that whatever's happening, it's in the White House and you need to get there and stop this signal. And the vampires put out a signal, and it's the same as the vampire signal. So they're like, it's a really powerful vampire, they think, with enough power to send a signal from Washington to California and kind of guide all these vampires. So the main characters get this signal, and then the base is overrun, and that guy, as he sends that signal out, he dies. Like, the vampires come in and overtake the whole facility, and there's an elevator, and all the Marines are like, or whoever's on this military base, I can't even remember, they're holding this door, and like all the people up at the top of the elevator are gone because they can hear the vampires coming down. So they're like, our first defense has fallen, and they break through the bottom, and then that's it. But he gets the signal off. So the main characters here, they get the signal that they need to go to Washington, DC, to the White House. And they know where there's an airport. So it's an empty, abandoned airport. And the farmer guy has some basic helicopter flying knowledge. Like, he was in the military a little bit. So he says he'll fly him, and they're going to fly into Washington that next morning. So they kind of camp out. And so they gas up this helicopter, and they all fly into Washington, DC, and they land on the front porch. And basically they start searching the White House for this signal person, this main person, but they don't really know the lay of the White House. So the boy and the girl go upstairs and kind of do some bonding while the guys are downstairs. And meanwhile, it's taking them so long to get there and so long to search, and they can only do it during the day, that the sun is starting to set. So basically, the farmer guy tells the boy and the girl that, you know, there's a car out front, like, find a car and just get out of here. Like, I don't know where you gotta go, but like, get as far away from this building as possible, because every vampire is gonna be coming here. So maybe if you can get far enough away, they won't care about you and run past you. They'll just come here. Like, I don't know, but you guys gotta run. So they go and they find a car, and the boy and the girl get in this car and they take off. And meanwhile, they kind of find the Oval Office, and there's a coffin in the middle of it. And so the boy and the girl are racing, and all these vampires start chasing their car. So they're driving down the street, dodging cars that are parked, you know, an abandoned kind of post-apocalyptic kind of street. And they're flying gas pedal, and they got guns, and vampires are jumping on their car, and they shoot them, and they're trying to shoot them off, but they're getting on the windshield and breaking the windshield, and they can't see. And so they actually hit a car, and they start rolling. And so they get in this huge rolling accident, but it kind of knocks off all the vampires on the car. But they end up upside down, and they're like disoriented, they're hurt, they're in a car accident, but they got their last bullets. And the vampires are starting to like crawl under, and they're like shooting these vampires as they're like upside down on their seatbelt, just trying to kill any vampires getting to them. But at the same time, the main character is trying to kill this vampire in the coffin. And as he's driving the stake in, the vampire jumps up and bites him on the shoulder and just injects him with this venom, and more or less says, like, you are going to be the next me. Like, I am not in this body. Like, I am my venom. So you can kill this body, but I just injected myself into you. So you will be the new lead vampire. So he kills a vampire, and he's sitting there, and he just doesn't know what to do. He's by himself. He's the last one left. And so he just pulls out his gun and he's like, well, I'm not going to let you turn me into the lead vampire. So he pulls out his gun and shoots himself in the head. And then he kind of just falls over dead. And so then the characters are there and all the vampires are crawling for the car, kind of get up in confusion and like start screaming and like holding their head and like running every which way, running away, and like none of them are going at them anymore. And so they're free to kind of come out. And so then they like are there walking the streets of Washington, D.C. when the sun rises in the morning. So then in the epilogue, it shows them kind of trying to rebuild their life, the two of them kind of living together, but how it's still dangerous at night because though the vampires don't have a leader, they're still kind of rogue and they'll attack you at night, but they're not organized enough. They're kind of how they were in the past. And so they're like, you're safe enough, but you just can't be out at night and you have to take proper precautions. And they're just living together and they got this farm in the backyard of this lake house that they're just occupying. But then, like, so they're like living happily ever after kind of deal. So then, in the true epilogue, the end of the book kind of zooms out on the White House as the sun's going down on like a random day. The sun's going down and there's just like weeds growing, vines growing, all that. And you just hear this giant mountainous roar, like a lion style hard roar, just come from the Oval Office. And that's where the epilogue ends. And that is basically what I can remember about this. The parts I can remember. I don't know. Might have to read it. This is a fun one. I hope you enjoyed it. So let's keep this train rolling. Let's see if I can't summarize the plot of this book from memory. This book starts off, and it's supposed to be a modern day, 100 years later, retelling of The Great Gatsby. So the book starts off, the main character is he goes live to his YouTube viewers on his YouTube channel. And he has 10,000 subscribers. And he doesn't know what to say, and the live stream is pretty chill. And no one's really talking, so he gets embarrassed and signs off right away. So then he decides to go outside and ride his bike down to the local ballpark. It's like a couple miles away, so he rides down there and he meets his friend who pulls up in his car. And his friend, they talk about this thing called Operation Kelly. I think Operation Kelly is what it was. So anyways, they had this plan that they were going to go to California where there's all these famous YouTubers, and they were going to try and collaborate with them. And the main character is Nick, kind of like Nick Calloway from The Great Gatsby, but his first name's Nick, and then his YouTube channel is Nick All The Way. So instead of Nick Caraway or Calloway, it's now Nick All The Way. Anyway, so Nick and his buddy's saying, let's go to California and let's try and find people to collab with. And better yet, let's collab with your cousin. And he's like, no, I'm not going to use my cousin for collaborations. Like, I'm just going to work on my own YouTube channel which is like a kind of a Mr. Beast style David Dobrik, like shock value YouTube channel. And his buddy is a streamer. He streams live video games. So his buddy's like, all right, well, you just say when you want to go to California and I'm in. So the character goes home and his parents are yelling at him to get a job. He's supposed to start working for his father's lawn care company, mowing lawns, starting off as a weed whipper. And he's like, and one of the things at the ballpark is just disheveled. It looks like no one plays ball anymore. It's kind of like a relic of the past. So now his parents are yelling at him and they're like, are you gonna mow lawns? And he's like, no, I have a YouTube channel. Like, I made like $100 this week. And his parents were like, that's not a real job. You're not gonna do what Daisy does out in California. And so they give him an ultimatum, basically. They're like, if you're under our roof, you will get a job tomorrow. But you're not gonna do this YouTube stuff. So he calls his buddy and he's like, you know what? Screw it. And so he calls his buddy and he's like, hey, Operation California is a go. We leave in the morning. Like, it's the only way I can keep doing YouTube. Let's do it. So his buddy picks him up in the morning and they head out to California. And they try to film. They think they're going to film their trip the whole way, but no one's really subscribing or watching their trip videos. So after a week of that, they just cut it short and just turn straight for California. And so they end up renting this really crappy, rundown little house, but it's in the shadow of this giant mansion up the hill. And the next driveway over is this huge mansion. And they're basically in an old guest house that's now for rent as a regular house. And so they're staying in there. And they've decided that they're going to try and find people. So anyways, they're trying to make videos and they're in California. They try to make a surfing video and just videos in the area, but they don't know anyone and they're losing their money fast. And they're down to like eating ramen noodles and cereal. So eventually James convinces Nick that he needs Nick. James is the buddy. James convinces Nick to go over to his cousins. He's like, we don't have to collaborate. Let's just go see if they know anyone. They can kind of feed us into the social pipeline. So like, okay. So they go to his cousins. Now Daisy has a husband named Tom. And Daisy is a kind of a life coach kind of deal. And Tom is a fitness YouTuber. So he makes fitness videos. And Daisy makes like these decorating your home kind of videos. So they're there. And Daisy says she wants them to collaborate. And it's rude that they didn't offer it. So they go home and they make plans to make a collaboration video with Daisy and Tom. And the next day they wake up and they go do a workout video as the backup people working out behind Tom. And then they try out Daisy's new like water tea she made with certain like plants she put into it. It's like coconut water or whatever. And so they make a video trying the custom coconut water and doing the workout. And then Tom invites them to go out to the club. So he takes them out in the town, but then while they're out there, Nick runs into this girl who's he thinks is really cute, and she seems to be into him, and she's chatting him up. And while he's there, he witnesses Tom making out with a girl on the dance floor that they brought over to their VIP booth earlier. And now he's on the dance floor. And then he disappears into the girl's bathroom with this girl. And so Nick is seeing all this, and he's complaining to this girl who he thinks is cute. And he's like pretty distraught over it. And so they go home, and Nick goes home, and the videos they made come out. But Nick is just distraught over seeing his cousin get cheated on, and how it was just so casual, and how it was right in front of him. He doesn't know what to do, and so he's pretty distraught. But at the same time, they get a little bump in views from the collaboration they did. So it's like his YouTube channel is working, but at what cost for him to see that? So then they also meet a few people who are other YouTubers who want to do collaborations too, that are Tom's friends while they're out. So Nick gets a letter from the mansion next door, and it's to this private YouTube party, a filming party. And so he decides that he's gonna go over there and he's gonna film. And he's gonna go to this party and join everyone because he's been invited and they're curious. So they get dressed up and they go over to this party, and it's filled with all these YouTubers, but they don't know the host. And it's this huge mansion with staircases, a giant in-ground pool in the background. So the main character, they're walking through this mansion and they're kind of in awe, and they're up on the balcony looking over the pool. And Nick, the main character, is kind of asking around it. All these people who all have cameras and they're filming and they're doing different stunts and stuff, and like jumping off tables and just being wild at this party. And everywhere someone's holding a camera and filming everything going on. And Nick keeps asking around and he can't find anyone else who has an invitation letter. And then finally he runs into this guy who's kind of this mysterious, eccentric, just super familiar looking face. And he comes to the realization that this is who owns the mansion. And the guy who owns the mansion says he wants Nick to be, he kind of brings Nick out in front of everyone and announces that Nick should be filmed with. He's the cool new guy and everyone should film with Nick, to his buddies James's astonishment. And so Nick, he kind of gets brought into some of these videos people are filming, and he gets put in the middle of it. And, you know, people who are doing stunts, they kind of do it around him. And he's just kind of, it's just so strange because he doesn't know this person. And so after, when everything's done, the guy kind of pulls Nick aside and points out that the music is actually custom free music that's royalty free, so they can put it on their videos. He actually paid these artists, who he says are his friends, to make these videos. And so he says that he saw Nick in one of Daisy's videos, and if he wanted to do more stuff like this and be brought into this group of filming people, they called their group the Dandies, and they're just this squad of people who film YouTube videos together, just a group of friends. And he said, well, I can bring you into the Dandies if you arrange a meeting for me and Daisy. And Nick's like, what? You want to see my cousin Daisy? And he's just like, I don't know about that. So the party ends and they go home. And meanwhile, Nick gets a call from Daisy, and he gets a call from Tom, and Tom is so upset. And they want him to rush over. So he goes over there, and Daisy is just throwing stuff everywhere. Tom's on damage control. She's breaking everything. And like, what's going on? And she's like, well, look at this paper, like this news article. And it turns out the girl at the club that Nick was sitting with was a reporter. And that's why she was kind of so flirtatious. And so she wrote an article about Tom cheating on Daisy, and now she's discovered it. And she's like, kind of like, am I the last person to know about it? And so she's throwing a fit, and it comes down to Tom pulls Nick aside and says, you can't say anything. You have to clear this up. And then, so when Daisy corners Nick and Tom's right behind her, she's asking, did you see anything? And Tom's behind him like, and then, so Nick is kind of like frozen. He doesn't know what to do, and he panics, and he says, no. And he's like looking at how like ripped and mean looking Tom is. And he's kind of a little intimidated. And so he just goes, no, I didn't see anything. And so Daisy kind of goes like, oh, so this reporter was writing a sensational article. This is all just tabloid stuff. And Tom then like turns into like, he's like, yes, and like brings her in. He's like, I was trying to tell you that. And so then they kind of go to reconcile their relationship, and Nick goes home, but Nick feels horrible. And I should note too that between Nick's house and Daisy's house, they have to cross this like really bad area of San Francisco. What was it called? Skid Row. So between their two houses is Skid Row, and it's just painted as like this really bad area, because I was trying to make the original Great Gatsby East Egg and West Egg, and then there's that bad place in the middle. So I wrote the original book, and my editor lived in San Francisco for a long time, and she's like, and I named it after what it was in the Great Gatsby, and she's like, well, in that city it's called Skid Row. And I was like, all right, I guess I'll change the name to Skid Row then, on her recommendation, because she lived there. And I was like, okay, sure. So anyway, back to the story. So Nick goes home, he's distraught, but at the same time, he's getting a boost from all these videos that came out with the Dandy Squad. And the main character is like, hey, I'm doing another, like a huge video. I want you to be the main person, and I'll put you on the thumbnail, but I want that meeting with Daisy. And Nick's thinking about Tom and what he did, and he's like, oh, his channel's blowing up. He's starting to make a little money. And he's like, you know what? He's like, it's just a meeting. Like, you're not gonna do anything weird. It's gonna be at my house. You're not gonna like make a move on her. We're all gonna be here. You're just gonna meet her, get an autograph, whatever you want. You know, get your autograph and go. And so the character's like, okay, deal. And so then the character makes this video where he jumps into his in-ground pool, and they throw all this, I think, dye in the pool, red dye. And so the main character jumps in this pool, and basically like 30 people throw red dye, just 5-gallon buckets of red dye in this pool. And that's kind of the stunt or whatever, and everyone's filming them. So that video goes viral, gets on the trending page, and he's on the thumbnail, and his channel's really blowing up. So the main character arranges the meeting with Daisy, and before the meeting, he gives Nick advice that him and his roommate, who are kind of starting to get a little irritated with each other, James is kind of getting jealous, he tells them to start a prank war. He's like, you could really boost your roommate and you, and it'd be a cool story for your channel if you guys started pranking each other. So the main character and his roommate start this prank war, and in the background of the book, the pranks are getting a little more extreme and a little more extreme every time. And while that's happening, Daisy comes and meets the character who owns the mansion, who is James Gatz is his name. So she goes and meets James Gatz, and then they realize that he had talked to her in some videos, like when she was a really small channel. He was actually really big on the app Vine, and they had talked to each other through Vine, or they went back and forth and basically had like a little internet crush on each other. And she realizes that, and she recognizes the videos that he's been putting out and been going viral recently, and she's super intrigued. And it's a little too friendly, and Nick's kind of uncomfortable with how friendly they're being. So, meanwhile, he gets in a fight with his roommate. He does a prank that's so bad that his roommate just basically leaves him, like punches him and leaves. And so like they've taken this prank war too far. But at the same time, he's getting this fancy car. So he buys this fancy like Ferrari, because his channel, now that he does more videos with the group of YouTubers, he's kind of blowing up more, and he's got this money coming in and sponsors. So he buys himself this Ferrari. And so now he's got this fancy car, and he ends up doing like more. They rent out this high school and have a paintball match inside of the high school, and that's pretty fun. And then James Gatz has another party, and he invites Tom and Daisy there. And while they're there, he distracts Tom, and he has Tom go with this YouTuber to do kind of a video on Tom's history. And Tom agrees, and he's like, this could be good for your channel. So Tom goes out for the interview, and James takes Daisy out back to near their pool, and the main character runs into the reporter, and he's kind of like has words to say with her, and he's kind of upset that with her about her lying who she was, and she's kind of like, well, what, were you never gonna say anything? You know, she's like telling him he's the bad one for going along that night, and he's kind of bad for being mad at her. And so meanwhile, he looks out the window and he sees James kiss Daisy and sees her kiss him back, and he turns and he sees the reporter girl there, and then he sees Tom walking up the stairs. And as Tom comes, the reporter girl is kind of like, doesn't like him. She saw him cheat, and so she like excuses herself. And he's there asking if Nick has seen Daisy. And Daisy can see over his shoulder, Daisy making out with James right down below outside the window. And he's like, look over here. Look over here, you know? So he pulls him away from the window and convinces him to go look for Daisy somewhere else in the mansion. So they go together, and he's like, Nick is just thinking like, oh my, like, what is wrong with my cousin and her husband? And so they eventually run into James and Daisy when they come back inside, and then Tom's like, oh, there you are. And then so they leave, and the main character is just like, doesn't know what to do. So he confronts James and tells him what he saw. And James kind of tells his story about how he knew Daisy. And also with the reporter, Nick's relationship kind of grows, because she agrees to record the Dandy Squad and kind of do news articles on them. So she's doing news articles on them, so she's around Nick a lot more. But Nick's confronting James about kissing his cousin, and James is kind of saying, we're going to run off together. You know, we've known each other for a long time. She doesn't love her husband. He's a cheater. And so suddenly Daisy starts showing up at Nick's house, and conveniently at the same time, James kind of starts showing up looking for like, hey, I need some sugar. Do you have any sugar here? Like, oh, Daisy, what are you doing here? So like, and Nick is like, oh, you guys are communicating and using my house as a meetup location, and me is the excuse. And so he's kind of mad about that. And Tom's suspicions begin to grow. And then Nick starts dating the reporter, but she's been told by her news station to make the YouTubers look bad, and specifically write the articles in a way to make them look bad. So she's kind of dating Nick now, so she's torn between her job and Nick. And so she ends up at some point going on a date with Nick, James, and Daisy, who comes along. It's like, okay, we're gonna go down to the beach. Well, at some point when they're down there, James kisses Daisy when he knows a paparazzi's watching, like the paparazzi's there. So he pulls Daisy in and kisses her, and she kind of is upset, like, why did you do that? And it's a clear, he's like, well, you haven't told Tom, and I want the world to know that you're mine. And so now Tom gets wind of this. So when they get home, Tom is there, and Tom and Daisy get in a screaming match, and James kind of gets in the middle of it, and Nick's just watching this disaster unfold. And James has a very noticeable car, and so Daisy jumps into a car, and jumps into James's car, I think. How does it happen? Somehow Daisy ends up in James's car. Like, she jumps in the driver's side like she's gonna leave, and then James jumps into the passenger side. But at the same time, they're live streaming out the window because they were live streaming before. So as they speed off, Nick can open his phone and hear them arguing. He can hear James pleading for her, and her being like, I don't know, just so distraught, and him being like, you love me, don't you? And as they're speeding down the road, they're going through Skid Row in the middle of this argument, and Tom is just kind of laughing as he listens to the live stream, like, this guy doesn't have a clue. As that's happening, a fan recognizes James's car, and this had happened earlier in the book, where a fan stepped out in front of the car waving to try and flag him down, but it's Daisy driving, and they're in the middle of an argument. And so basically only the live stream camera sees this person step into the car, and so they hit this person, and then they begin to speed off, but they cut the live stream off. They realize they're live streaming, they cut it off. So Nick, Tom, and the reporter all head to go find this spot of this accident. And when they get there, they see that Daisy and James had fled the scene. They're no longer there. And there's a crowd gathering around, and this lady has a blanket over her, and she's passed away. And so everyone's like, did you see the live stream? Like, it was James. It was James Gats. And so everyone's like, oh my gosh, we saw who it was. And the cops recognize Nick from James's video, and they try to interview him, but the reporter and Tom kind of get him out of there. And so they go home, and they find Daisy waiting at home. And so Tom goes with her, and Nick goes back home and drops the reporter off, who's like, this is just all too much. And she's like, I gotta go. So later that night, Nick finds James hiding kind of behind his house. Like, he's like, hey, whispers to him. He goes over there like, what are you doing? Like, you're ducking the cops. He's like, you need to tell him what happened. He's like, you need to tell him Daisy was driving. He's like, no, I won't. Like, I love Daisy. I'm telling him I was driving. And they're like, I'm saying she wasn't even in the car. That was the voice of another girl. I'm not going to say who the other girl was. And so he basically decides he's going to cover for Daisy. So meanwhile, so he's like, I just want you to tell Daisy that I love her and give her these messages or whatever. And so the cops come to James's house. He's like, I'm turning myself in. And so they come there, and they arrest him. And the reporter is paid to kind of write the smear article, and she just doesn't know what to do, so she kind of breaks up with Nick. And then while James is in jail, YouTube deletes his channel because he killed a girl on live stream, basically. So they decide to terminate his channel, and at the same time, all the other streaming platforms like TikTok and everything, they delete his channels too. And it's kind of like they just make him disappear. Like after all his millions of subscribers, every video on the trending page, it's just like overnight they just make him disappear because of that live stream where that girl got killed. So he gets out, and Daisy and Tom openly go to the news and say that they were together that night and that she was not the one in the car and that they're happy together. And they basically openly like say they're gonna fix their marriage. And James sees all of this, and he sees everything's deleted, and he films one last video, and he tells Nick goodbye. And the way Nick hears his goodbye, he's just kind of thinking about it for a while, and then he realizes that the goodbye was almost a cry for help, like it was a warning. So he runs to James's house, and James is out on bail. I don't know if I said that. So he gets out on bail, but everything's deleted. And so Nick is running through the mansion trying to find James, and he gets up on the balcony and he looks out the window at the pool, and he sees James standing there recording himself with a camera. And then as he's standing there, he realizes James is holding a gun. And then so James kind of sets down the camera. He kind of puts the camera down, like slings it over his shoulder and pulls out the gun, and he puts it up to his head. And Nick is just beating on the window, like trying to get his attention and just screaming. But James either can't hear him or ignores him. So James pulls the trigger and just falls into the pool. And so Nick runs down there, and the whole pool is just turning red, and it reminds him of the time all that dye was in the pool. And so he jumps in, and he struggles to pull James out of the pool, but he's limp. He starts giving him CPR. He calls 911, and the EMS do the report, and they report James dead on the scene. And the last thing Nick sees, he looks down and sees James's camera at the bottom of the pool. Whatever last video he made basically got wrecked by the water. And so James just kind of is distraught, and he's like, I can't do YouTube, this is bad. So he decides to go home. And the epilogue of the book picks up with James is back at his hometown, and he's mowing lawns for his dad, kind of. And so he mows this lawn. It's a 90-degree day, and he's really hot. And so he loads up the mower, and he goes home. And then once he gets home, he goes into the house, and he opens his computer and opens up this live stream, and it's kind of a huge celebrity YouTuber rock, paper, scissors tournament, and he's in there against his old friend James. And so he starts it up, and they're in front of all these people. It's live, like raising millions of dollars. And so he does this. He plays rock, paper, scissors, and thinks he loses to his buddy James, but he's like, hey, it was really good to see you. I miss you, bud. And James is like, I miss you too, man. And James has been successfully streaming. So then he hits upload on his last video, which is a lawn mowing video that just shows him cleaning lawns and mowing lawns. And he looks at all the views and all his subscribers and at the house that is paid for from this channel. And so he's kind of like satisfied, and he jumps in his pool to wash off the sweat. And then he gets in his car and he heads down to the baseball field where a charity or a community baseball team's going on. And the baseball field is all cleaned up and taken care of because of him and his lawn mowing. He has fixed up the whole field, and now there's a whole game going on. And he's watching these people play, And that's when the reporter walks up to him and she's like, hey. And he's like, oh my gosh, like we're on the other side of the country. And she's like, I know, but I just had to see you. And she's like, if you want, you know, I could try and live here. She's like, they got a local paper. She's like, I couldn't work for that newspaper anymore after what they made me do. She's like, so I took my own integrity and I kind of started writing my own blogs and making my own kind of news and stuff. And he's like, wow. And she's like, yeah, I've had some success with that. And so she's like, if you want, I'll stay. And he's like, I want you to stay. And she's like, good. So they kiss. And then they can hear the ting as they turn and they watch the baseball game in the old field. And Nick is happy and satisfied to be home watching the game in the middle of summer. The reporter had a name. I forgot what it is. Okay, bye. Massaging my videos and talking about them. Let's do Forever Man. I wrote this one after The Great Influencer, but it took so much editing that it came out. I wrote this before The Great Influencer, but it took so much editing that it came out after The Great Influencer. So, this book starts with this girl, and she gets a job in Chicago. And she's heading to her new job, and she sees this blanket on the ground, and she's just wondering, like, she kind of trips on it, and she just looks down, and there's like this random blanket. So she goes into this job interview, and they're like, we will take you to your new boss, and he wants to meet you personally. And it's basically like, she's like, really? Like, the owner of this, the CEO of this corporation wants to meet me personally? Because literally on the walk-in, she looked at a magazine rack and his face was on the cover of Times. And so he's like this big famous CEO. And she's like, I'm just like a lowly secretary. He wants to interview me personally on my first day. So she goes up the elevator to this like penthouse suite of an office overlooking the Chicago skyline. And she walks up and he's sitting at his desk in his underwear. And he's shirtless. And he might have pants on, I can't remember, but he's definitely shirtless. So, and he's kind of like, hello. And he basically tells her, in order for this job interview, you have to understand where this company comes from. And so he's like, I'm going to tell you the story of how this company came to be. And then, so chapter 2 starts, and it's a young version of him. And he's about the same age, I guess. But he's like maybe like 10 years younger looking. And he's about the same age. I can't remember. Anyway, so he's kind of working for his dad, who his dad owns this a pharmaceutical company, and they have a lab where they test drugs, and he's trying to make immortality. And so the main character kind of goes in and he gets tested on. Like, they run these tests, and his dad's trying to find immortality for himself. And so he is basically, because his DNA is so close to his dad doesn't actually care for him. So his dad puts him through the ringer and like injects him with all these test drugs to see what will work on his dad whenever he finds something successful. And they have like monkeys and rats and stuff in cages that they test. And so, so he feels like he's just another one of the rats or another one of the monkeys, like his father doesn't really care about him. So at night he goes to the bar, and he goes under these gaslit lamps, and he notices how one of the lamps has electricity, and it's kind of, he's just marveled at it because there's no electricity yet on this street. And they're like, electricity is just at the cusp of its invention. And he kind of gets hit. He stumbles out of the bar drunk, and he almost gets hit by this like horse carriage looking automobile. And it's one of the first ones he's ever seen. He's like kind of in awe at this new horseless carriage that drives by. And so he ends up the next day, he goes, and his dad wants him to try these 2 pills. So he tries both these pills, and then he goes out for a night of drinking again. And then he ends up taking these 2 women back to a hotel. And on the way, he passes this homeless guy. And the homeless guy is asking for money. And one of the women he's with walks up and tries to give him money, and he pulls her back. And he's like, you don't know how unsanitary these people are. Like, stay away from these people. And he pulls out his coin, and he's like, you want this? He's like, here, go get it. And he throws this coin over the guy into a river. But the homeless guy just doesn't look at the coin, just never stops staring at him. And he looks in this guy's eyes, and they're so like encapsulating. Like, it's almost like there's a whole universe behind his eyes. And so the main character here, who is what the heck is his name? Let's see. Constantine. I should have known that. Constantine Neonite. So he starts off Constantine Neonite, and by the end of the book, he changes his last name to Plenary. So the corporation is called Plenary Inc. So he wakes up in the morning, he's alone, and he's expecting to be super hungover, but he wakes up and he feels almost like he got a really good night's sleep. He doesn't feel like he went out partying at all. And so he kind of makes his way into work, and he's super excited about it, but then they want to do these experiments on him. And so they cut his hand, and he's horrified. They tie him down, and his dad watches, they cut his hand, but as he stares, the wound heals. So whatever it was in those pills, it made it so that he like basically has a healing ability. And so he's like horrified. And then they run these tests where they burn him and they try all these things. And he sits there and he's horrified, but he's also amazed because he's healing from it. And so finally they let him go. And so he like spends the next week getting experimented on. And then he ends up, he spends his nights at the bar just drinking, and he does like drinking competitions with people, and he's just like doesn't care because he gets hungover and his dad pays for it all in exchange for him being experimented on. And one night he meets this girl, and this girl, she really wows him, and they spend a night at the bar together, and she's like asking him to show her he basically cuts himself as a bar trick, like to show off to people. And so she asks to see more, and she asks him all about it. And eventually at the end of the night, she asks to go with him. Like, let's go to your work. Let's go check it out. I want to see it. And he's like, okay, sure. So he takes her into his dad's work, and they go in there, and basically she keeps asking like what did they do? And anyway, she coaxes him over to the pills, where he took the pills, and he's kind of feeling uneasy about it, a little off, and she actually snatches the pills, but he grabs her, and he grabs one of the 2 pills, and then she hits him and he falls and she takes off running. And at the same time, it started raining outside. So it's a really rainy night, and he's not used to rain. It doesn't really rain much. And so he's like, she runs off and she takes off in the night to the left, and there's a security guard there, and he's like, is everything all right? And he's like, get that girl. But they go out into the dark, rainy night, and they can't see that far because it's raining pretty hard. And she's just kind of disappeared in the night, and he's left with just one pill. And he's like, oh my gosh, I lost one of the 2 pills that's my father's for his trying to find the fountain of youth. So the next day, his dad is furious, but the rain hasn't kept up, and city's kind of starting to flood in certain areas. And so he is like really mad, and the rain's been pouring. And so he's kind of getting punished, and he turns into the janitor, and he thinks being a janitor is so much beneath him. And so for the next couple of days, he's the janitor, and he's going to work, and the rain just never stops, never lets up. And one of the days as the janitor, he's there, and the river in the city begins to flood. There's been so much rain that the river can't keep up, and it floods over, and the streets start to fill up, and they start to have earthquakes. And so he's feeling all these earthquakes, and so he comes and like he's like in the building, like shaking, and all the animals are going wild. So his dad tells everyone to go home, and he actually stays a little while longer. And when he goes to leave, he goes down to the lobby, and the water in the lobby is like a foot high. And he's like, oh my gosh. And so his dad has one of those motorless carriages, an automobile. And so they push the door open against the flood, and more water comes rushing in, filling the whole place. And they're like shocked at how much water there is. So they get in the horseless carriage, and it's like tall enough to stay above the water, and they drive out of the city into higher ground where it's not as flooded, and they decide that they're going to go wait out the rain and all this flooding. They have a cottage up in the mountains, so they're going to head up in the mountains. And so the dad packs up his other brothers and sisters who are a lot older than he is, and they kind of like, he packs up his immediate family into his automobile once they're home, and then like the family meets there because of the storm, and so they all get automobiles, and then he sets Constantine on just a regular horse-drawn carriage with the other help. And so he's kind of like, yeah, I'm like the black sheep of the family. He's like, my dad's sending me back here with all the help, and like they're riding on ahead. So the flooding continues, and they head up into they spend like a day, it's like a day's travel just to get up this mountain. And there's a town up there. And in the town, there's this zoo which has this giant boa constrictor that's called Titan is the name of it. And this boa constrictor in this zoo is like 50 foot long, like its head is like this big around, just like this freakish thing, like this snake is like this big around. And it's just in this zoo, and the whole town is kind of dedicated to it. They have a fountain of the snake fighting a giant alligator, I think, in the town square. And the fountain's not on because of all the rain. So he eventually, he's just like, there's nothing to do in this town, so he's just checking out this indoor zoo that's dedicated to this snake. And he eventually goes home to his family, and they notice all these animals keep passing through their yard, and pretty soon people start coming up the mountain in droves, like refugees, and they're saying like all the land is flooding, and there's these giant springs that opened up from the ground, just shooting all this water up, and it's just like everywhere is just flooded, and it's growing, and it's like coming. And so all of a sudden there's just so many refugees that they start coming onto their property. And so they have all these refugees and they can't get them off. And these people are just kind of camping on their property. And then there's even animals, and there's like mice and rats just moving in and out of the camp. And then one morning, Owen wakes up and he looks out at the mountainous view, but instead what he sees is an ocean. So he can't see down the mountain anymore. He just sees the water level. And it's like about to reach their yard. And so all the people camping kind of head up. And then Owen and his brother, they get their dad, and they all decide that they're just going to head into the wilderness, follow the animals, and just head up the mountain, just kind of blindly. So all the people and everyone just head up this mountain, and they're running. And Owen's got his dad. His dad's like 90 years old. He's old. And he's just like old as old can be. And so he's hanging behind. And the help, once this water is like chasing, it's almost keeping up with them as they head up the water. And so Caden is with his dad, but the help panic. And they see the water and they let go of the dad. And they're like, screw this. And they just leave him and start running. And Constantine's like, well, I'm not going to leave my dad. So they're all running up this hill. And they find this spot where there's a small, like a 10-foot cliff where there's a walking path where steps have been carved in. But there's so many people crammed that they can't get up there. And meanwhile, the water almost hits their feet as they're trying to wait. So Caden kind of gets lost in the crowd, and he like boosts up his dad, and then he tries to climb up and gets over, but he gets lost and he can't find his dad anymore. And the water's already, he looks, it's already like rising up the cliff. And it's about to go over the cliff and keep coming up. And the crowd, like there's people still waiting in the water. People couldn't get in. And so he's trying to find his dad. And finally he's like, maybe once I boosted him up, he just headed up the trail and he's further up. Like there's no one here and the water's here. I have to go looking further up the trail. And then as he's doing that, he's heading up the trail. He can't find him. He's calling, but the water is just right behind him always, just following him. And at one point, he gets knocked over because of that snake from the zoo, the Titan, and it goes right by him. And he goes like, everyone in the crowd like screams, everyone falls away, but the snake has no interest in them. It's just running up the mountain itself. And so as that snake goes by, they get up and they go running. But as Caden's going, the water catches him. And like it falls into his waist, and it's ice cold water. And he breaks free and he starts running, but he's just getting so out of breath. And he's fighting this water and he's running and running. And then eventually just the water's just too quickly rising, and it kind of grabs his legs again and slows him down and trips him up, and then it overtakes him. And all of a sudden he's in his chest and he's like floating, and he's like trying to grab a tree. But these waves just keep hitting him and bashing him around. And eventually he just gets so tired, and the water begins to rise. So where he's at, there's all of a sudden like no trees. Like he's above the trees. Now he's just in the middle of water, like basically in the middle of this ocean. And the waves are throwing him around, and eventually he goes under and he can't get up to the surface and he passes out. But then he wakes up, and well, first of all, it goes back to the girl in the interview, and she's like, you drowned? Like, what? And he's like, yeah, just keep listening. And so they actually go down. He's like, can we go downstairs and get lunch? And in the lobby, he has a limo driver waiting for him, and the limo driver has a suit. And so Constantine puts on his suit, and now he's dressed, and they go out in the limo. And so back in Constantine's story, he wakes up in just a wasteland of like, he's half buried in mud, and he wakes up and he's looking around, and he's like lost, and he's at the edge of basically a beach, and there's just waves just calmly lapping, and he's like in this like mud, he's like half covered, and he slowly breaks free, and he stands up and he panics because he sees the giant boa constrictor, and he's like totally panicked, like rushes back on his hands and knees, but then he realizes it's dead. But then he realizes like the smell is really nasty, and he looks around him, and all around him is like all the other people and everything, and everyone's basically drowned and just scattered all across this beach, except for the pills kept him alive. So his healing factor basically kept him alive. So then he heads down and he starts following the water as it recedes kind of down this mountain, and the mountain begins to rise up around him as the water reveals it. And he's like, he doesn't know what to do, so he's just following it, but it's a wasteland. And he essentially gets so thirsty that he turns into basically a walking zombie. Like for like 5, 6, 7, 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, he's just following this water, and it's salt water. There's nothing he can drink, but the pills keep him alive. So he can't die, but there's nothing to sustain him. There's no food, there's no water. So he essentially just turns into like this zombie creature that he hears himself moaning all the time. And then eventually he sees a puddle that gets left behind. And in this puddle is fish that get caught up. So he grabs a fish and just basically eats them right there out of the puddle. And then he finds like fresh water. Like it kind of like sprinkles here and there, and he'll like drink the fresh water. Or I think he comes across a stream somewhere. Eventually he gets far enough down, like towards the mainland, and he finds a stream and it's fresh water, and he kind of drinks that. Something like that, I can't remember. So then he's walking around and he sees the girl from the bar that took the pill. He runs into her in the wild, and he's like, hey, it's you. And he chases her, and he's like, hey, and she sees him, like panics, and she's just as rough looking as him. And she takes off running, and he takes off running after her. And he eventually follows her into this a bunch of these rocks that are kind of stacked weird. And as he goes in there, she's hiding around the corner with a log and just hits him in the head and knocks him out. And he wakes up in the ground, and she's just gone. No trace. He looks for her for a while, but he can't find her. And so in the meantime, plants have started to grow up, like weeds have started to grow. He decides he's going to follow this river. And on the river, when he runs into her, before he sees flowers, it's the first color he's seen since the flood. And he's just mesmerized by these flowers, and that's when he sees her. And so he keeps walking, and he keeps going for days down this river, just doesn't know why he's wandering, but it's fresh water. And he sees a little baby rabbit eventually up the river, and he's like in awe. So he follows this rabbit, and he goes off the river, and he sees smoke, and he's like, it's a fire. So he gets confronted by these, he goes to find these people, and he gets confronted by these people who are like these old men in Rome in robes and like hairy beards. And as they get talking, he realizes they're like these religious people. He calls them Adamites, and they're basically like Amish. And he's like kind of distraught because he's like, the only people left in the world are the Amish. Like, all I want is to get back to society, to get back to my place. I run into the Amish. So this guy, the leader, his two sons are Shem and Ham, and the dad is Noah. And so Noah's got this big boat. We'll call it an ark. And so he comes, and they take in Constantine, and they feed him. And he's like in awe because they have all these animals in cages and stuff. And they explain that they've let out all of the animals that aren't predators, and they've let these non-predator animals just roam and spread, you know, the rabbits and whatnot. And he's like, pretty soon we're gonna let out the apex predators. He's like, but we just want the other animals to be able to get a foothold first. And so Constantine's like, what? But they're uncomfortable. Like, they kind of think Constantine's a demon. They're like, you shouldn't be here. So Noah's like, hey, my sons are really nervous about you. Like, I'm sorry, but could you you're gonna have to stay somewhere else. So Constantine, after they feed him and they give him new clothes, which are these robes, and he's like clean and comfortable for the first time, he gets food, then they're like, you're gonna have to leave. Like, we don't know, you should not be here. But he doesn't want to like leave them. So he goes and camps like 2 or 3 miles away on top of a hill where he can see the ark. And he stays up there, and Noah's like, this is a good place for you. And so he'll be up there, but he doesn't know what he's doing. And Noah kind of visits him, and eventually Noah like starts bringing him provisions, and Noah teaches him how to build a home on this hill. And so he learns, you know, woodworking from Noah. But eventually Noah kind of gets old, and Noah's sons still come around, but they don't trust him that much. But eventually Noah dies, and he hears about it and he's sad. But Noah's sons and their grandsons see that Constantine hasn't aged since they first met him. And so they're like, yeah, this guy's like a demon or something. Like, this guy's not right. So they like start avoiding him. So then Constantine kind of becomes secluded. And as the trees and the growth kind of builds up, he can't see the ark anymore. It kind of gets overgrown. And then one day he notices like the ark begins to get torn down and huts are built around it. And then a forest builds around his house. And then so he can't really see. And he just lives in the middle of the woods using Noah's techniques to just keep his home in order. And he just lives there, and he gardens, and he takes these lessons, and he learns to live off the land. One day, like, these kids come, and they like see him and they run away. And it's almost like they're like playing a game, like who can go the closest to his house. And so he's like, what the heck? Like, how long has it been? So he decides to come out. And when he gets to the bottom of this hill, he comes out. He emerges at like this makeshift city. And there's streets, and there's huts, and there's these buildings. But the dead center of the city, there's this giant tower that just stretches into the air. And it has like Noah's building technique that he used for the ark. He can recognize it's still in the architecture of this tower. And he's like blown away at this thing. And he's just so fascinated that he goes to it. And basically he sees a sign that says, you know, if you want to work on this, well, here's the wages we'll provide you. And he's like, I'll do it. So he actually like takes a job helping work on this tower. And he gets up in this tower and he helps them build it for a couple of years. And they just keep building and building and building. And they're saying like we could build this tower to God. Like, that's how great we are at building. And one day he's in town, he's getting lunch, he's on his break. There's this bright flash and he falls on the ground and he can hear the tower just collapsing. And he wakes up and it's just chaos and dust in the street. And he looks around, but there's some lady screaming, but he can't understand her. And there's a man, and like they're like speaking gibberish. He can't understand either of them. And so he eventually goes around and he realizes that the people have been transported. Like, there's people that are just disappearing in the city. And some people wander into the city and they say like, yeah, we were in the middle of the city and we woke up like 3 miles away. And it's like, whoa, like people are just transported everywhere. And so eventually he gets a grip on this, and you know, the city kind of disperses, and the city struggles because the gibberish people were speaking were different languages. So now there's people who can't understand each other, but there's other people that can understand that. And so all these people that speak these different languages like break off into these different groups, but then the city is no longer as unified as it was. And so Constantine starts trading between these people. He's like, he realizes like if he's around these people enough, he slowly begins to understand their gibberish, and he understands all the different people. And so as he begins to learn all these different languages, he can, inside of the city, start to like trade. Like, he brings apples to this guy for logs to this guy, and eventually he builds this like company of like a trade company. But then the weather changes and it begins to freeze, and then he suffers through 300 years of winter basically, and it kills off like so many people, and resources are so scarce. But he's still like working, trying to keep this company aside. But then eventually when the weather turns good, these people, they invent these weapons like bows and arrows, and they come in and they fight, and he realizes he's losing, like he's at risk of losing all the stuff he's worked for, because these armies that are now growing of these people could just come in and take all his stuff, because he has these, he like starts doing excavating too, because he realizes at some point he trades someone and they have a chest full of books, and the people's like, yeah, we were digging outside of town, we found this chest full of books, and he opens it and it's books from before the flood, books on astronomy, books on all these things, and he's just like blown away, and he's like, oh my gosh. So he takes all his money he made from trading and he starts excavating, like digging in the earth, just these vast like mines of like just trying to dig down and get down to under the mud and get down to find artifacts. So he wants to bring back the world he knows. So he's like, if I can find more of this, I can bring back my world. Meanwhile, he lends some of his books to these Greek states at this time. And so these Greek people kind of get he sends them these books on astronomy. In exchange, they send him gold and coins that he can use. And he has a business doing that, like trading information. And so eventually these armies start coming in though and taking everything out, and he's just so scared that one day just an army can come in and destroy everything, and all his books and all that astronomy can be lost. So he hears about this library in Alexandria. So he travels and he takes all the books he's found and he goes to this library, and he sees this library and he's just fascinated. He becomes a curator for it. And that way he can be around all this books and all this information. He can kind of go through it, and he sees that this library is advancing civilization. And he's like, the faster I can grow this library, the faster we can get back to my home, how the world was. And so he does that, but one day there's just this battle breaks out in the city. Once again, he's like, war has come to my doorstep. And it's these Roman soldiers, and they're fighting with these ships, but there's fire, and this fire breaks out in the city, and the fire spreads across the city, and it ends up catching the library on fire, and the whole thing burns down. And meanwhile, this guy named Caesar comes up to him and is like, I've heard about you, like your reputation's spread. And meanwhile, the city's kind of burning. He's panicking, trying to put it out. He has all the workers doing a bucket brigade from the water, trying to stop the library, but it's no use, it's gone. And so Caesar is basically like, in the middle of this, like snatches him up and is like, you're gonna work for me by force. And so Caesar takes him in, and they have a meeting before Cleopatra. And he realizes Cleopatra's right hand, her aide, is the girl that took his pill, the one that he saw after the flood and ran off. And he's like, it's you. And she's panicked, and she like whispers to Cleopatra, and the soldiers come in, and like Caesar's like, no, like this ain't happening, because Caesar's the one with more authority there. And so she kind of stands down, and the girl is just kind of distraught. So then Constantine gets poisoned in the night, and but he wakes up healed, but he's like, oh, fine, this is the hangover of all hangovers. Like, finally, I feel a hangovers because I was poisoned to death. And she is in the room waiting for him to wake up with guards there. And she basically says, Cleopatra believes me to be a god. She's like, I have been in Egypt for all these years pretending to be a god, and all the pharaohs, I've been helping them to build this country. She's like, this country, this empire, I have helped curate it, and they think I'm a god. And so she's like, Cleopatra saw my reaction to you, and she saw Caesar wouldn't let her touch you. She's like, so she had you poisoned in the night. It wasn't me. And so he's like, what? And she's like, yeah, I told her to stop. I told her, you are also a god. You are Ptah. And she's like, I'm Ptah. He's like, what? And so they had all these meetings with Cleopatra on one side and her, and then Caesar and Constantine on the other. And then eventually it's time for Caesar to go. So Constantine's basically Caesar's slave, so he forces him to go to Rome. And she ends up, had spent so much time with him and they had so much in common, she has enough pull where she's like, I'm going to leave, and Cleopatra has to let her. So she follows him to Rome. And in Rome, they help Caesar run the government, but then they kind of start a romance a little bit, and they're distracted, and Caesar gets killed, and they get handcuffed, and they get chained up after Caesar gets killed, and they get thrown into slavery, and they end up getting taken to Pompeii, where they're stuck in this, basically, as slaves working in this winery. And so they spend like 30 or 40 years working off their basically indentured servitude. So they work off everything, and then they go to the city of Pompeii and they start a pottery factory, and they end up making so much money that after such a long period of time, they buy the winery. So now they own the winery, and there they get married and have kids. But then there's this earthquake, and so Constantine takes two of his sons and they head up to this mountain, and they see like the mountain has collapsed and there's just this magma just bubbling, and they're like, oh my gosh. And Constantine falls into the magma and he burns his foot, and so he passes out, and he wakes up in the morning, like he falls and he's like grabbing and getting dragged down. So in the morning, he wakes up, but his foot is still scarred. And he's like, this is the first thing ever since I took the 2 pills that has ever left a mark. He's like, wow. So then they start having grandchildren, and even their grandchildren start having great-grandchildren. And all of a sudden, one day there's another earthquake, but then the mountain starts smoking, and it's really bad. And he's like, we have to get out of here. And there's like people fleeing the city, and it's kind of like starting to erupt, and it's starting to be really bad, and everyone's like getting out of there. But his son is like, there's people like running across our winery, like someone has to watch this place. And he's like, no, leave it, it's not worth it. This winery means nothing. And his son's like, this is the family winery, like this is our legacy as a family. And he can't convince his son to go, but the rest of the family's leaving, so he has to like guide the rest of the family out. And meanwhile, he's like, okay, just stay safe. If anything happens, go down in the cellar. You should be fine in the cellar. Like, don't fight anybody. And it sounds like, I'll do that. Meanwhile, so they get like 10 miles out of town, and Pompeii just explodes, and the volcano is just so massive. And it's like all the way 10, 20 miles away, they're just getting ash like snowing on them. So they go back, and he can't find his son. He can't even hardly find the wine. It's like there's ash like 20 foot tall, and he can't find his son. And he just has to accept that his son was killed. And so they, the rest of their family, they go to Rome, and they begin their lives anew in Rome. And their kids grow old and die, and their grandkids grow old and die, and their great-grandkids grow old and die. And as that happens, their kids begin to see them as like, their family begins to see them as like mythical creatures. Like, they're like, we're not part of our family anymore. And they decide not to have any more kids because it's too hard to watch them grow old and die. And he's like, it's just bad. So eventually they have a son, they have a great-great-great-grandson who's named Constantine after him, and he ends up being an emperor. And so Constantine and his wife, they help him rule over the Roman Empire. And so they help this Constantine rule, but then like that grows on, and the Roman Empire starts to split, and their family begins to grow so distant that they're like, we don't even know these people anymore. Like, we're not even like attached to them, you know, we're so distant. So they decide to just wander into the wilderness, and they kind of go into the Germanic Empire, and they kind of end up wandering all across Europe, just spending years, and they end up eventually hitting the Atlantic Ocean, and they end up in a little fishing town, and they stay there for a time, but then that gets attacked by Vikings, and there he sees his wife fight the Vikings, and he sees how she was trained in Egypt as a warrior. So she fights, and then so after that, then they sail to like Britain, and they hear about this new world, but Constantine is like, okay, his wife really wants to go to the new world, so they travel to the new world, and they end up like seeing how there's like this slavery in the new world and how they were slaves in Rome. So they're like, well, we were those people once, we don't want to live like that. So they become abolitionists, they become Quakers basically. Was it aborigines? Anyway, so they grow this farm and they build it, and they end up being like, Constantine starts taking up metalworking, and he ends up being a blacksmith, and they have a farm, and she begins making pottery, and they end up like growing into this real civilized, like the leaders of their town, as like civilization slowly kind of starts to form in the new world. And meanwhile, his wife ends up getting pregnant again, and it's like on accident, and they're like, okay, I guess we're gonna have a child again. So they have this daughter. Meanwhile, they've decided that they don't want slavery in their town, so they're gonna work these people out of this slavery. And so they basically like give the townspeople an ultimatum, like, you can do your stuff without slaves, or we're gonna run you out of business. We have a monopoly on all the industries, so we'll come into your industry and we'll take your livelihood away. So you're not doing it in our town with slaves. And so the townspeople one night come to their house with pitchforks, and the town's name is Salem. And they end up like getting wrongfully accused, and they try to fight off the crowd, but they end up getting basically arrested, and they get put in a phony trial, and they get taken out to this cornfield, and they basically get burned at the stake. And Constantine wakes up in the morning, and he looks over, and he realizes at night that his wife doesn't have the healing factor he does, because she only got the one pill. So he knows like she can't heal from injury. She basically just doesn't age. Like, she can heal slowly and she can't drown, but like she can't, if you cut her, yeah, it'll heal faster, but it won't be like supernatural healing. So he knows like she is liable to be killed. And so when they're burned at the stake, he knows like she won't survive it. So he wakes up in the morning in the ashes, and he's just like digging through the ashes, and there's just nothing left. So he goes to the leader of the mob. He shows up naked, still covered in ash, and strangles the guy to death. And the people think it's a ghost, because he's white, covered in ash, like, and they think a ghost came and killed him. So then he goes off in the wilderness, and he tries to take his own life in a bunch of different ways, but he always heals. So eventually he comes back, and he's like, he shot himself, just did everything. And so like, once he gives up on that, he sees that people thought he was dead. They took his daughter and brought her to a home. So she's with a new family. So he goes and takes all the money they saved, and he just leaves like basically a chest full of just coins on their doorstep. And he just heads north, or he heads just off. He heads south actually. And he ends up just wandering and gambling in brothels. And eventually the Revolutionary War breaks out, and he fights in this war in a battle, and he realizes how it's the first time he's felt anything since his wife died, because he's just been wandering and drinking and going gambling. And he actually ends up starting his own like gambling brothel kind of bar. And so he just runs that. And so when the war breaks out, he fights in it. And he basically just loves it. And he waits for all the wars. And so he goes along. He ends up fighting. He ends up growing his bars and becoming a chain of bars. And he hears about this war over in Europe. This great war, but it's across the ocean. And his last time he crossed the ocean was so bad for him. He wants nothing to do with it. So he's just waiting, hoping the war breaks out back home. And so he waits and waits and waits. And then he hears the war ended and he's devastated. And he's like, I will never miss a war like that again. So when World War II breaks out, he joins immediately. And he ends up going to D-Day. And he ends up fighting at D-Day, and then he uses all his ties back home to get sent over to Japan and fight in island hop in Japan. So he ends up over there, fighting over there, and he ends up getting caught in a bonsai charge and injured, and he gets taken to a hospital where they witness his healing. And so he actually gets arrested, and he gets taken down, basically like blindfold put over him, and he gets taken, just flown, like sailed across the sea. He gets flown in planes, driven in cars. He doesn't know where he's at. Just sacks over his head. And he ends up in like the basement of this building where they interrogate him for years and figure out everything he knows, and they just keep him in there and they study him. And he basically has this apartment in there and he just lives in there. And there's this little janitor boy, and he becomes friends with the janitor, and he's like saying like, you know, how honorable the kid's job is, and he's doing great, and how like the company can't run without what he does. And eventually one day the janitor boy shows up, and he's like, you know, gray haired and older. And the janitor's like, you know, I took all the tips and the advice you gave me. He's like, and I put myself through college and I did all this stuff. And he goes, I'm the CEO of this company. He's like, and 10 years ago, we broke our contract off with the government. So we're completely private now. And he's basically like, as the CEO of this company, you're free to go. And so Constantine's like, what? So he goes up like out into the sun, and he's in the middle of New York. And it's just like the cars are all crazy. The noise is crazy. Everything's so colorful. And he ends up deciding to go down to like a veterans association to go to the bar. And he goes into this bar, and they're like, oh, like you went to Vietnam too? Like there's all these vets. And then all these older guys are up at the bar, won't let him go up to the bar because he's a younger vet. And they're like, we don't let your kind up here at the bar. And he doesn't understand. These other guys at the table are like, hey, come drink with us. And like, hey, we're other Vietnam vets. Like you're cool with us, man. And so he drinks with them, but then he sees the CEO who had just let him free, and he's like, here. And so the CEO takes him across the street, and they eat lunch. And the CEO says how they've been testing his blood and stuff in years. They said, we've cured so many diseases from studying you that like you have saved so many people. And he just sees this, and he realizes all these years he thought he was just this object of death, like this war machine. But he sees what them studying his blood and everything had done. He realizes how many people he saved. And so the CEO cuts him the check, and he's like, you were locked. He's like, this is the best. I had to go to the board and explain your situation. He's like, this is the biggest check they would allow me to cut. And they basically cut him a check for like 300,000 or $1 million or something. And so, but he's like just reeling with like, I've saved so many people. And so he gets a plan in his head, and he hears about Vegas because he's read newspapers and stuff. So he heads straight to Vegas, and he starts playing poker, and he starts winning his money. And he basically goes through Vegas and card counts and does all this stuff from all his years of gambling until they essentially run him out of Vegas. And he decides like, okay, Vegas is tapped. and he like quadruples his money in that time. So then he starts a pharmaceutical company, this Plenary Inc., and he grows it. And he starts being the one who tests his own blood. And then he gets all these departments and these buildings rising over the world. And he just builds these medicines, and then he helps to invent some machines that help. And so he's just basically this company that's just helping people around the world and like curing diseases. And eventually he ends up in this tower in Chicago. It's like his main tower. And he has this suite at the top. And then, so one day he's walking into work and he sees this homeless man who's standing on the side of the road. And he looks at the homeless man. He looks so familiar. And the homeless man's standing there and he's like here. He sees the man's holding out his hand and he's like begging for change, but he sees his other change and he looks in there and he sees a coin, and he recognizes the coin as a coin from before the flood, like this ancient coin that he hasn't seen since before the flood. And so he reaches in his pocket and he gives the man all his money. And then he sees the man's shirt's kind of torn. He's like, here. He takes his shirt and his suit jacket off. He's like, here, take mine. He gives him the shirt off his back. And he's like, here. And then he's like just mesmerized with the man's eyes. Just looks like a universe behind his eyes. And he's like, here. He gives him everything. And the homeless man just kind of stands there. He doesn't really move or say anything. And then he's like, okay, like I have to go to work, you know? But the man just never says anything. So he kind of turns and he heads into work. And, you know, the homeless man like is standing over this blanket that he set out for himself. And so Constantine goes to work basically with his shirt off. And then that's when he meets the girl from the beginning. And so then she works with him and she goes in his lab and she realizes that what he's done is real. Like she actually witnesses his healing and she's like, this story is real? Like this is all real? He's like, yep. You know, and she spends like 6 months just working and he's like, I want to like train you. I want you to know how to do this. He lets her make certain decisions. And then one day she wakes up with a knock at her door. And she checks it and she has this package. It's a vanilla envelope. And the vanilla envelope falls out. And it's got this bottle of pills in it and just a letter. And in the letter, it's Constantine. And he's like, you remember my story I told you? And he's like, when we were in Salem and we had a daughter, he's like, I never lost track. He's like, my whole life after that, no matter what happened, I always made sure to follow, like keep track of where my daughter was. And when she eventually had a daughter or a son, like I kept track of them and I followed them all the way through the years. She's like, eventually leading to you. He's like, your great, great, great grandmother was my daughter. And he's like, I'm going away. He's like, I've done everything this life can do. He's like, I'm leaving the company to you. He's like, everyone knows it. And so she like turns on the TV and she sees that there's this helicopter that just flew into a volcano. And they're like, it's Constantine Plenari's helicopter crashed into a volcano today. And they're like, active CEO. And it's like her name. And she's like, oh my gosh. Like, I am like CEO of Plenary Inc. And Constantine like crashed into a volcano. And like, because she remembered like it's the only thing that could hurt him. And so she kind of heads downstairs with the idea of like, I'm going to take all the lessons I learned from him and I'm going to do what I can to run this company to the best of my ability. And that is Forever Man. Oh, and it says, in the letter, it says, these pills in this bottle are the pills. He's like, I reverse engineered it. I figured out how to make the immortality pills. He's like, I'm going to leave them with you. He's like, you're the only one who has a set. He's like, it's up to you if you want to take them or not, but here are the pills. I leave them with you. Do with them what you will. And she takes them and looks at them, and she throws them in the trash, and then heads out to try and run this company. That is the Forever Man. Anyway. Okay, bye. Before we get to the last book in this series, in the first book I wrote, out of this series of books I published into paperbacks, we have to get through Sapiens, my second novel I ever wrote. And I'm thinking about this one. The thing is with this one, is that better? Okay, a little bit more. Somewhere in between. The thing is with this one, I don't know if I remember it. But I can tell you, it was planned to be part of a trilogy. So this is the first book in a trilogy that will never be written. I don't remember where I planned on it going, but I think I was selling like 5 to 7 books a month. And I was just thinking, that's not worth writing 3 more or 2 more. Anyway, so this book starts with the main character, who is basically he's a teenager who's a government experiment, and he basically they ran these tests on these kids and injected these drugs into them when they were in the womb, and depending on how the drug reacted, the kids came out with either one of 2 things. One, they came out with superpowers. That was the power to control the elements. I don't know if they have super strength. They might have had something like that. I see how much I remember. I remember one of the powers they get is they can control the elements. Like one can create fire, the other can like shoot out ice spears and stuff. So the other thing you can get, though, if you don't get a superpower, is 3 kids get super intelligence. And so the kids with super intelligence there's 2 older ones and then 1 younger. So there's an older boy, an older girl, and there's a younger boy. And so the kids with the superpowers, before the book starts, have escaped and they flee. And so the kids with the smart stuff, the brains, are left behind with super sapiens. So they decide that they're gonna break free and chase after the other kids, and they're gonna use their super brain power to find the other kids and then join up with them out in the world. So they use their brains to break out of the government facility and escape. And they head in the car off into like the country, into this deep place in like upper Michigan. And it's not the United States anymore. It's kind of a dystopian United States where it's not like a free country. I can't remember. It's like got an emperor and stuff. So it's like the United States is part of this empire. So anyways, they break free, and I can't even remember. They end up going to this town and like way off in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, just as far off the trail as they can get. And the people use their brains, like the super smart people, like freakishly smart, they like run diagnostics and just try to figure out where would the other people be. And they end up on this one town in way upper Michigan where they're like, this is where they have to be hiding out. So they head there. And then they end up buying this house way off out in the woods and start fixing up this house. Meanwhile, they're kind of searching the town for these other kids. And so they're like fixing up this mansion. Well, they send the youngest one to school because I think they're like 20, the two older smart kids, and the main character is the younger one. So he goes and enrolls in school. And when he gets into school, he's going about his day, he's looking around, and he ends up running into this girl that he knew had ice powers, one of the people who ran away. And he's like surprised, like texts his family, like, I found them, they're here. And so the girl leaves and like gets out of there. And he's looking around like he can't find her, and she's like left school, she's split. So he goes home and he reports. And they're like, okay, like we're in the right place. We can meet up with the others now. So he goes back and is like at school, and they're just gone for a week. He doesn't see him. And then one day after a week, he's trying to get acclimated, and they're also trying to blend into this town. So he's trying to get into the school. He's trying to, he's faking his schoolwork because it's so easy for him. But at night, they're like still working on this mansion, and he's going to school, and the girl has disappeared. She hasn't come back to school until for about a week. And then one day, he comes back and he sees her in the parking lot. And so he approaches her, and another one he realizes is there. And like, so it's two of them. It's a boy and a girl. And he remembers them from back then. He's like, goes to meet him and be like, hey, we escaped too. And instead, when he gets to him, they shove him up against a car. And then the girl shoots an icicle out and just stops it short of his throat. So he's up against the car with this icicle to his throat. And she's like, you threatened me, like, you're threatening our safety. Did they send you? Like, they think he was sent by the government. And he's like, no, like, and they end up just getting on the motorcycle and just speeding out of there. And he's left in the parking lot, like, with a trickle of blood running down his neck. Like, what just happened? So meanwhile, the two older, like, super smart kids, they go and they figure out where all the people with superpowers are living. And there's like 4 or 5 of them. So they go and make contact and kind of make a deal with them. So after their negotiations, and they explain what's going on, they kind of just go to school. And then the main character, so he's got this, these superpowers. So he's kind of like in gym class. He's finally getting to see what it's like to be in the real world. So he's having fun in gym class, and just like shooting baskets, being just like super skilled at everything just because he's so smart. And there's a girl in the class who has a crush on him, so he decides to at some point take her out on a date. And meanwhile, the girl that's part of the superpowers is like, just like radio silence it, get as far away from me as possible. I don't care if our family has a deal or not. Like, I don't want to be near you. I'm suspicious of you. You can't trust you smart people. Like, you're just so manipulative. So he goes on this date with the girl, and after he's done, he drops her off, and basically the girl with the ice powers kind of appears, comes out of nowhere after the other girl leaves, and she kind of threatens him, like, I know you're evil, like, you shouldn't be taking these civilians out, and, like, you shouldn't be doing that. Like, you could really kind of hurt someone. Like, I'm still suspicious of you, like, you should stay away from these people. Like, I will protect these people from you, is her kind of attitude. And he's just like, what the heck? Like, I'm here hiding out just like you. And he's like, kind of gives it back to her. Like, I'm not going to stop my life. I'm here living my life. And she's like, well, you came to our town. Like, go somewhere else. And so he's like all frustrated with her. She's frustrated with him. But they're both trying to go to school. And so they go on. And at some point, what happens? They kind of get found out by the government, and so they're like, they flee. Also, there's some stuff that could be planned for the sequel that's not in this book that I'm remembering as being at the end, but that's not yet. So all of a sudden they get, they realize the government's trying to, like, figure out where they're at. So they flee into the north, like they go straight into Canada, into like no man's wasteland, like an area that's been destroyed by war. Like, nobody goes here. The earth has been salted. They just go into this no man's wasteland. And I think it's her and him just end up running in this, just take off in their car, and they're running for safety. And they end up coming to this like abandoned building that she reveals is part of a resistance. And it's just this barn, and they go in there, and there's this car that's draped up, and it's like this fancy car, and it's all decked out in like armor and weapons, and it's just kind of like a Camaro kind of deal. And then so they're in this barn, and they're like, okay, what do we do now? Like, we're trapped. And all of a sudden there's like helicopters outside, and all this stuff flying over, and like lights, and they're looking through the cracks of the barn, and they're all surrounded. And they're like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? So they he gets this car, and he starts hot wiring this car, and he's like, the battery's good, and it's got gas. Like, it's a well taken care of car just out in the middle of this wasteland in this barn with a sheet over it. And he's like, what in the heck? So he basically hot wires his car and gets it started, and they hit the gas, and they just go flying like right through the walls of the barn, right through the barricade, and they just start flying back down the road. And they're using all the weapons on the car to kind of fight off these helicopters and all the people and all that. And, the car is just so souped up, like, got like NOS in it. Like, they just turn it and can outrun the helicopter, or like shoot the helicopter down, or I don't even remember. Somehow they get away. And then they end up going home. And this is either before they go to the barn, or this is after they get home. I can't remember which comes first, but at some point she realizes that everyone else has been captured except for her and the main character. So they decide that they're gonna break in. They know where all their family, they call each other family, and they have since the beginnings. They're just like call each other family in the government facilities. So they decide that they're gonna try and break back into this government facility, and they're gonna save their family. So her and him, like, he uses his master planning, like his super smarts and her abilities, and they break into this like facility, and they end up fighting all these guards and stuff, and they're like freeing each other, and they're breaking in there, and they go through, and basically as they save people, their numbers grow. And so as their numbers grow, they're like getting stronger and stronger, and like as a family, as a whole unit, they end up fighting this facility how they were trained to fight as a full unit. And so the main character, he ends up helping, but it's just the main character. Like the other two smart kids are gone, and so they get free and they break free of this facility and they bust out of there, and they head to go back to the mansion to regroup. And when they get there, it's kind of like quiet, and they're looking for the other two smart people, and it's like at the end of the book, and I can't remember if this is how the next book begins or this is how this book ends, how I had it planned, but one of the smart kids, the guy, was basically like they were lying, like the guy and the girl, but the younger kid who went to school and everything, he was not in on it. He had no idea they fooled even him. Like it says in the book, like the only people who could fool one of them with the super smarts would be one of their own kind. Like no one else could even fool them. And so it's revealed that he's been fooling them the whole time, and then there's like another government ambush right there. And so the main character manages to just slip out, but he's like alone, like in a ditch, just hiding. And he sees this ambush, and he's like, he can do nothing but hide as they capture everyone. And then the two smart people are kind of loading everyone up. And then they're like all captured, and they're kind of like mission accomplished. This is the whole reason we came here, was actually to capture all the superpowered kids. And so the main character is like hiding in a bush, like I've been fooled. And he's watching like her, and meanwhile they've kind of fallen in love and have a romance going on. You know, it was like that love-hate relationship turns into love. So she like is hauled off with everyone, and he's just stuck watching as they're all hauled away. Man, that could be how I planned the sequel to start. See, I can't even remember. It could be the epilogue. Let me see the last page here. So, I wonder if I will ever get used to feeling her kiss. I wonder if I will ever get used to the feeling her kiss gives me. I pray that I don't. As the flames from the others got further and further away, and the night closed in on us, I hope Spencer knew to get a ride home in the Suburban. So, Spencer would be like the main girl's main close brother, like almost like her twin. So yeah, all that betrayal was meant to happen in the sequel that would just I never got around to writing it. And it was like, no one really bought this book, so it was never worth continuing the story. So at the end of this book, they save them from the government facility, and they kind of burn the place down, and they just erase any evidence that they were ever there. And so then they can all go back to school and kind of get their lives back to normal. And so that's how that one ends, is they're kind of just go to a high school party, and they're at a bonfire, and her and him decide to go slip off to go hang out, just the two of them. And so I think there was Spencer's the other one, that's the school age with them, like her twin. So he's saying as they leave, he's hoping that Spencer knew to get a ride home with the others because they're taking the car. So that's kind of how it ends. But yeah, I had a plan for them to be ambushed by the two older smarts, and then in this sequel, he was gonna like wonder about that car, and so he's all alone now, and he just has nothing but his brain, and he has to figure out how to save them from the main government building. And so that's just gonna come down to, he's gonna realize that car was so new, so he's gonna travel back to that barn and start investigating, like, who is taking care of this? How can I find allies? And he's gonna discover just this whole underground organization. I actually thought about having there be I think there was gonna be a facility under the barn, like an elevator to get to an underground facility that they were right on top of. So, yeah, I think whatever happens is they get caught, and then when they're in the barn, they fight off all the people in the barn and escape, and they're able to go back and rescue everyone else, and then erase the fact that, like, they completely erase the record that they were ever found out. And so that's how they're able to go back to school. Yeah. No one really, it never sold more than 5 a month, and I was like, eh. And it was actually supposed to be almost a chapter for chapter recreation of Twilight in a way, where she would be Edward and he would be Bella, more or less, just traveling to this new town. But that's what that was, my second book ever. Yeah. Continuing this series that I try to do. I try to get one out every Monday till I've done them all. And there's 2 more after this. And this is Hurricane Dan. Hurricane Dan. Now, Hurricane Dan starts off with the main character losing his job. And he's in a suit and tie, but he's thrown out of his job and he decides to go to the bar. But he doesn't have any money. So he's at the bar. He starts waiting for people to leave their drinks unattended, and then he'll reach over and grab their drink, and then he'll walk around the bar with their drink and drink it. And he eventually gets caught, and he gets thrown out onto the street. And I'm trying to think how he ends up in the suite. So he kind of spends the night out in the street, and he's got nowhere to go, no money to stay anywhere, and he basically, all he has is the clothes on his back, which happens to be a business suit. So he ends up kind of wandering until he kind of discovers this community of homeless people, and so he joins them, and while he's there, he meets this guy Barnes, and Barnes kind of looks like Santa Claus. He's like a homeless Santa Claus. And so Barnes, you know, his brain is kind of fried. He can't talk very well, and he kind of is just belligerently drunk all the time and just says flip-flop about a bunch. He's like, my flip-flop. Anyway, so while they're there, they see this guy, and this guy is just tripping up on something, and they're thinking about bath salts or whatever, and they're like, what is this guy on? And he comes over, and he's just wandering, and he's like stumbling, and he lands on someone, he bites them, and the other person starts screaming and bleeding, and everyone's like pulling the first guy off the second guy to get him separated, but the first guy's like going irate, and he's trying to bite people, and he's like scratching people, and so Barnes and the main character, Dan, decide that they're not going to stick around. They're like, all right, let's get out of here. And so Barnes and Dan, they sneak off, and somehow they get to a luxury hotel, and something happens where they luck out and they sneak into the penthouse. And so they're up in this place and they're just in the penthouse after that night. It's just the businessman and then the homeless Santa Claus. And they're in this penthouse and there's a fully stocked bar. And they're like totally just over the moon excited. And so they just get into the booze and they just basically throw this party up in this penthouse, the two guys. And then in the morning, they're there and they somehow, Dan discovers a briefcase, and when he opens it, he's like just shocked. The briefcase is filled with $100 bills, like to the brim, packed. And he's counting it and he's like, there's $1 million cash in this briefcase. And he's like, Barnes, we've got to get out of here with this briefcase. And so they head out of there and they're like, we're gonna get caught. There's security cameras, they're in trouble. And so they're trying to get by in the lobby. And so I can't remember, somehow they get out of there. And it's been a while, I have to read it again. So anyways, they end up out of the lobby. And they end up out in the street. But then they've been made, so people are looking at them, looking for them. And it's at that time that they kind of get caught by a police cruiser and they get arrested. So they're in the back of this police cruiser. And the police cruiser, they put them in there and they put the briefcase in the car for evidence, I guess. And so Dan and Barnes are in the back of this police cruiser. And at the same time, I know how they end up in the penthouse. A hurricane is sweeping the East Coast and it completely floods Manhattan and it just hits it. And there's this storm and the chaos of the storm, they're able to slip and take cover. Because, this storm rolls in. And so they stay in this penthouse for a couple days after leaving the street. That's what happens. And so they're up there for a couple days when they find the briefcase. And the storm kind of passes so that they're able to leave. But then they kind of get made when they're trying to leave. And so they get arrested. And now there's this cop has them in there, and there's tunnels you use to get into New York, like not a subway tunnel, but just a road that goes under the river. And the cop car's by one of these roads, and there's people screaming and calling for help. So the cop's like, hey, you stay in this car, and I'm gonna go investigate these people who need help. Something like that. So then, wow, I can't remember. I guess, first of all, why I thought he was parked by a tunnel is Dan goes into this tunnel. He wants to get out of the city, but there's all these traffic jams and stuff. And so Dan's like, let's get out of the city. And they're trying to get out of the city. But as he gets down this tunnel to go under the river, and it's just gridlocked traffic, and he's trying to go down this trail, and all of a sudden, the people start running back at him. And he sees that there's more people that are all tripping, like the homeless guy from the night before that bit the guy. There's a bunch of these people just coming at him, and they're the ones causing the traffic jam. And there's an accident up ahead that was presumably caused by them. And so there's people crawling towards him. He's looking in this tunnel. And so he runs out in the daylight, and that's when he gets made and caught by the cop. And so the cop drives him over the precinct and then is kind of parked by the precinct. And so Barnes and Dan end up, after they go to the tunnel and see more 10 of these people like this. And so meanwhile, the police scanner is going wild about all these attacks and stuff all over the city. And so the police cruiser parks the cruiser, and so Dan and Barnes are sitting there, and they're handcuffed. And meanwhile, as the cop is gone, one of these creatures comes up, a zombie. Now they've figured out, after all the attacks, they're like, it's zombies. So one of these zombies comes up to the cop cruiser and starts trying to break in to get to Dan and Barnes, who are handcuffed in the back. And it's kind of like breaking through the window, like it's breaking the window down, trying to get in. Like it's got, you know, this kind of more strength. And so they're like in here trying to get out. And I think the cop ends up shooting the zombie, and he opens the door and he unhandcuffs Dan and Barnes and lets them go. He's actually like, hey, like, I would take you in on any day, but today, like, people need me. You know, I can't be arresting you too. Like, you can't waste my time. Like, I have to get to the bottom. There's people that need help everywhere. And so Dan and Barnes are emptied out into this street, and that might be the time they go into the tunnel. They might go to the tunnel after or before the cop car. I can't remember. It's been so long. I'm gonna have to reread this myself. But either way, so they end up leaving, and they're like, hey, the cop let us go. Let's not try our luck. Let's get as far away from here as we can. And Dan's got his briefcase just clung to him. So they end up, you know, wandering the streets, but the streets are kind of getting worse as they're starting to get more and more overrun by these zombies. And they're growing, and all around them, like, there's some people still trying to almost go about their day, but society is breaking down all around them slowly. But like, some streets haven't been hit yet. And so eventually a bunch of people decide to haul up in an apartment store, and Dan ends up with this group of a couple people, and there's a very attractive girl that Dan kind of crushes on, and they meet in this department store, and they're huddled there while, you know, kind of the security guards and the police are like, stay in this store. We're gonna stand out front and make sure no one gets in here. But meanwhile, they get overrun, and then the front door in the store starts breaking. In the middle of the fight and the chaos, Dan's like, we need to get out of here. Like, these people defending the store are about to lose. And so he convinces the girl and a couple other people in Barnes to leave before they're like, the front door of the store is glass. So they leave, and they break into a bar. Like, after they run down these back alleys, they get out of there, they go as far as they can, and they end up crashing in, it's like a dive bar with no windows and no walls. It's completely bricked in, and it's been abandoned. So they stay in there and they spend the night in there, and they eat chips off the counter. And I think Barnes drinks a bottle of booze and just passes out. And so in the morning, the streets are kind of eerily silent, but they can hear moaning, and they realize, like, there's these zombies out here they don't want to alert. And one of them knows someone who has a sword collection, and they're like, it's just like 3 streets over. My friend collects samurai swords, and they're like, maybe we could go see if he's there. The girl does. And so they're like, okay, we'll try to get to this guy's apartment. So they make a run for it. In the meantime, there's a plane crash that kind of explodes and blows up the street, and makes all kinds of commotion, but they're just shocked, you know, like if these things took down a plane, like is this all over the place, you know? So they get to this apartment, and the guy there knows more. He has a working TV and he has a radio, and so he tells them that these breakouts have happened all over the world, and that, you know, it's everywhere, but they're fighting to try and take it back. But Manhattan is the worst because of the dense population. And so it's kind of a last priority, the last place to be saved. But right now, everywhere's chaos. So they're like, you can't depend on anyone. So he also tells them that the New York Library is a safe zone and that they've developed a quarantine. And so he says he's not leaving his apartment. He's happy with it. But if they want to go to the quarantine, that's a safe place they could go. And they have food and stuff, because he's like, you know, I have this food as my food. Like, you guys can't stay here and use all my rations. He's like, but I will let you take a couple swords. So they take a couple samurai swords, and then they start making their way. They beeline it to try and get to the safe zone. And after they battle and use the sword a little to carve their way down the street and rush, I think they're about to get overwhelmed when the zombies around them start getting shot, and that's when they realize they've reached the outer barrier of the safe zone. At which point, their weapons are confiscated, and they're told to take refuge in the library, and they're told that the safety zone is a grid where it's like the outer perimeter is held, and then there's lines of defense all the way leading up to the actual border of the library. And they're like, the idea is to hold for as long as they can at these outer streets, and then as they fall back to the next street, and then the area they're holding will get smaller and smaller, and just they want to hold as wide an area as they can. So Barnes and the crew all get soup kind of deal, like, and stay with the refugees, and they stay the night there. And in the morning, the outer barrier is falling, and they need reinforcements, and they want people to take another shift. So they basically arm Barnes and Dan and the group and assign them a street. They're like, you guys have to help hold this street. So they're like led to this area, and they spend the morning basically shooting at zombies as they try to come up. And as their ammunition gets low, and the zombie horde that's drawn by the shooting and everything is just growing and growing and growing. And so they lose that street, and they have to fall back again. And so now they're like 2 streets from the library, and they're getting pushed further and back. And meanwhile, they get a call that outside of Manhattan, the military's starting to get a hang on the zombies. Like, it's starting to get control, and they actually see Jersey City get firebombed. And they're like, oh my gosh, they're gonna firebomb Manhattan. Like, we can't be here if they do that. And so they're like, panic. And they're like, okay, what do we do? Meanwhile, they fall back to almost the library. And so like they can see all the defenders in such a tight perimeter. And there's all these trucks that are snowplow trucks, and all these snowplow trucks are they're used as part of the defenses. Like, that's how the city built their defenses, with these snowplow trucks and fire trucks and police cars and stuff like that. And so they get the idea that they can maybe make a run for it with these snowplow trucks and try and plow through all the zombies. because they're about to collapse. There's nothing they can do. Like, they just got to get out of there. They got to do whatever they can because the library is going to fall. So they're like, let's get in these trucks and let's just burst through the barrier and let's just try and take off. And we can load all these people in the bed of all these kind of snowplow trucks. And they're like big semi kind of construction, what do you call them? You know, the big bed that can fit like 30 people. So they load everyone in there and they're like, all right, and basically turn these into a military convoy. And then in the middle, they got like fire trucks and everything as well. And so they just plow through and they're trying to get going. And they go about a block, but the zombies are just too thick. And just through sheer mass, these trucks are just getting bogged down, and it's just sheer numbers. And so all the military people and the cops and stuff are shooting, and they're trying to protect this stalled convoy. But it's like, we're not going anywhere. And so front truck stalled, back truck stalled, and so they're just fighting a desperate, almost a hand-to-hand defense. And Dan gets an idea that they're going to, or someone gets an idea that they're going to take a fire truck and they're going to extend the boom and they're going to reach to one of the buildings, and if they can get it to a window, they can break the window, and then they can all get as many people to just rush up this ladder and get into this building as possible. It's just an emergency. We got to get out of there. And so they start going, and Dan's getting up there, but then before they get to the window, the ladder stalls, and they're looking down, and they're like, yeah, that's because the fire hose, the fire engine, has been overrun by the zombies. What little defense they had, I think it was like 5 guys trying to defend the one guy working the ladder, has fallen. And it's like, so they're looking down and they're just hanging out in the open over all these zombies. And it's like they're the last ones left, like 20, 30 people just on this ladder. And so Barnes, who had mentioned when they were in the penthouse and they were talking, getting to know each other, Barnes had talked about how he used to be a firefighter. And in this moment, Barnes just screams and he slides down the ladder and he just hops over the edge into the crowd of zombies. And they can hear the zombies going wild. But within a couple seconds, the ladder starts moving again. And it gets them just the distance they have and just finishes what they needed to get to the window. And it hits the window. And so then the crowd all the people on the ladder start rushing into the building. And Dan is looking down at Barnes and all he sees is just the zombie horde. And he's like, distraught because they got him, So eventually the girl prompts Dan to get moved. Like, you have to move. Like, we're gonna die if you don't move. You have to let him go. And he's like, okay. And so he goes up the ladder and into this building. And they sneak out a side door, but it's no use. There's just zombies everywhere. So they decide to go to the subway. They see a subway station and they're like, I don't know, there's just zombies on the street. Maybe there's a chance if we go under the street that we can get away. And so they go down in the subway station and there's no power, it's dark, but the hurricane had also flooded everything. So the subway station is flooded and the pumps aren't going, there's nowhere to, there's no power. The subway station is just flooded and dead, basically. And so they come to the station and they like come to the edge and the water's like up to their waist or up to their knees or almost, and so they're like moving and they can hear the zombies starting to follow them down the stairs. But the further in they go, the darker it gets, the less they can see. And so I think they turn on their phone lights, and they jump into the subway, and they're like, let's go down to the next station, and let's just see if we can't swim down and get to the next station and get up and see if there's less zombies there and we can make a run for it. And so they start swimming, and they have everyone's kind of like holding their phones and like trying to get light. I think, no, they had a police flashlight. And so they're trying to like hold this flashlight and swim with this flashlight. And all of a sudden, one of the people just goes like, boom, gets sucked under the water. And when they pop up, they're screaming again in the fuss and everything, and they go under, but in the fuss, it knocks the flashlight off however the person was holding it. I can't remember now. But whatever light they had gets knocked down, and it floats to the bottom of the water, and it lights up all the water. And they realize that there's just a blanket of zombies just standing on the bottom of this water that they're swimming over top of. And like, it's just their wet hair is just like floating in loose tangles all around them. And all of a sudden they're like getting grabbed and yanked down. And so Dan happens to have the briefcase, which has air in it. So him and the girl are using this briefcase to stay closer to the top of the water. But one by one, all the people swimming around them are just getting like ka-doom and just disappearing. And so by the time they get to the next subway station, they're the only two left are just Dan and the girl, because they were able to use this briefcase to float and kind of be higher. Or maybe there's a couple people that made it. I can't remember. Either way, like a lot of people get lost in this subway. So they get away from the subway tracks, and they get to the next station, and they run up, and there's still zombie hordes there. And Dan gets, like, they get mobbed by zombies at the top of the stairs, and they fall. And Dan drops the briefcase, and then the crowd of zombies kind of overtakes the briefcase as they're getting pushed back. And Dan's like kind of looking like, do I go for it? Or like, is it worth my life? And the girl is kind of looking at Dan like, come with me, let's go. And he's just looking at the briefcase like, I can't leave the briefcase. There's $1 million in cash in it. And so he's got to make a decision. And I think he decides to leave it. H decides like, I can't go into a crowd of zombies. So he runs, and they turn a corner, and they run into an army tank, and it's a real army convoy that have made it to Manhattan finally. And they turn the corner, and they just light up the street, and they just completely clear it. And then it's like, they take Dan and the girl, and it's kind of like the day is saved, you know? In the epilogue, Dan is with the girl, and it's like 9 months later, and they're on a vacation together in Hawaii. And on this vacation, they just kind of talk about how it was discovered that there was a pharmaceutical company that was developing a new drug, and they got to watch live on TV this compound getting raided that created the bioweapon that created the zombies, as they kind of sip pina coladas and flick the people off at the TV kind of deal. And then at the very end, it mentions how after the zombie had come, they went back for the briefcase, and how they weren't on vacation in Hawaii. They were kind of like living in Hawaii. Like, they want to get as far from the mainland, as far as like a possible outbreak as possible. So they just bought a house in Hawaii, and now they're just living in paradise together. And that's kind of how the book ended. That was Hurricane Dan, or at least from what I can remember. Here we have the final book in the series. In the first book I ever wrote, Apocalypse Theory. Look at that baby. Look at that little baby. Now, I went through and cleaned up some of the bad spelling and horrible dialogue in like 2010 or in like 2012. I think I published this in 2012. In 2010, I went over it again, and this was basically done by a publishing company, this book. So I wanted to take it back into my own hands. So I renamed it The Sword and the Staff, and I cleaned it up. So if you look on Amazon, it's on there under The Sword and the Staff. But that is not in paperback, and this isn't available anymore. So there are no more hard copies of this. And there are no hard copies of the one that's still on Kindle, which is The Sword and the Staff. It has the same symbol, but it's yellow. I was looking for something that represented like the one, and then I just typed in Hebrew, and they're like, that's what the number one was. That's how I ended up with that. Okay, let's see if I can remember the first book I wrote. I plotted this book in like 2006. So the book starts off with the kid his parents have just died. And he's in a military camp with his uncle, kind of like a boarding school military camp, and his uncle is just putting him through like all these tests. Like he has to run an obstacle course, and he's just like thinking about how his life got flipped upside down ever since his parents passed away. So he's running this obstacle course, and if he doesn't finish in time, his uncle's like, you're not eating dinner with the rest of us tonight. So I think he kind of fails the time, and so he doesn't bother to follow his uncle in, because he's like, I guess I'm not eating tonight. And he sees a glow off in the woods. So he gets up, he goes to inspect this glow, and he sees a dead deer, and then an angelical figure standing over the dead deer. And he's like whoa, like stunned. And the angelical figure like puts her hand on the deer, and there's a light glow, and then the deer like wakes up and jumps up and is like, its wounds are healed. And then it takes off running into the woods. And then the angelic figure like looks at him, and the angelical figure's like, you were the one that's going to save everyone. And he's like, what? And then all of a sudden he feels a searing burn in his arm. And when he looks, he has this symbol just burned into his skin, basically like a tattoo on there. And he's like, and then all of a sudden he feels really sleepy, and he starts to fall asleep. And then he wakes up, and he's still laying on the obstacle course, like where he had just gone to sleep the night before, just kind of laying and where he posted up. And but he looks at his arm, and the tattoo is still there. So then the book jumps forward, and oh man, see if you can remember that. The main character is living on his own, and he's 18, and he lives in his own apartment, and he works every day. I think he dropped out of school. Maybe he graduated, I don't know. But he just lives in his own apartment in the middle of Detroit, and he's just like going about his life. He's got like this crappy, tiny studio that's just packed in there. He's eating nothing but ramen noodles, just trying to get by. And one day he wakes up, and there's this warning, like emergency warning test, that's saying, you need to seek shelter. And he thinks it's fake. Like he's like, thinks it's just one of those timely automatic warnings. But then as it keeps beeping, he's like, oh, this is real. So all of a sudden he hears sirens outside, and he goes out, and there's the military, and the military is kind of gathering people. And so he rides his bike to try and like go figure out what's going on. And they're like, there's nukes incoming. Like nuclear wars started, and the nukes are just heading here, and we need to get into bunkers. And so he gets in this truck, and they're like flying, and they fly into like this open parking lot with a little tiny hut in the middle. And then like they're rushing everyone in the hut, and he gets in there, and there's stairs leading down. And then he realizes this is like a hidden military structure. And underneath this little hut is this giant elevator, and he gets it in with these people, and they're all going down. And all of a sudden there's this violent earthquake, because it's like the nukes, and then they can see the doors overhead just lock shut. And so then they're just stuck in this thing. And meanwhile, a secondary character, Barnes, he wakes up after the explosions, and he's in the middle of New York. And like New York is like all rotted and decayed, and it has like hundreds of years worth of growth, as if New York had been abandoned for 200 years. And he wakes up, because the last thing he remembers is he was like frozen somehow. He ends up frozen. And so when he wakes up from being frozen, he like emerges, and he's standing in a skyscraper, but the wall is missing, and there's plant life and stuff all over the room. And he's just looking over the cityscape of New York, but it's just all roots and plant life and animals, and there's no people. And dang it, I remember what happened. After the nuke, there's a zombie outbreak in New York, and Barnes is just like in New York on vacation. He's trying to survive, and they're like flying through the streets of New York in a car, and he's got a rifle, and he's like a cowboy kind of guy. And so he's like on the rooftops, like sniping zombies, trying to help people. Like he helped some lady get into a building, and that's kind of how he's introduced. Is this lady's like cornered, and all of a sudden the zombies start dropping, and she looks up, and he like tips his hat from the like 4 stories up. And so then he's like trying to survive these zombies, and he's got his truck, and he's just plowing through them. And they end up going to this facility, and I think it has like a self-containment freezing thing there, like an experimental like freeze human beings. And he gets cornered by all these zombies, and like they're attacking him, and he falls back into this freezing container, and he's like shh. And then all of a sudden he wakes up, and that's when he wakes up. Like, and the chapters kind of jump back and forth, but that's when he wakes up, like in like the zombies are all gone, and they had chased him up into this skyscraper. And now he's like looking around, and the room's empty. There's like dusty old skeletons on the floor, but it's like they're full of like moss and grass and like flowers. And he's just looking around like, where are the zombies? And he's looking at this abandoned New York. And then meanwhile, the first character, Mason wakes up. He's down in this tunnel, and they've been down here months, and they're like getting antsy and running out of food. And the people are kind of trying to revolt, but the army is trying to keep everyone contained. They're like, you can't leave, and they're like, you can't hold us here. So Mason's trying to fight for the people to be free, and he meets these 2 other people, Desiree and her brother. I don't remember the brother's name. Tyler. Second word. So Desiree and Tyler. So Desiree and Tyler befriend Mason, and they keep trying to fight. And then there's an expedition up there, and the military's all distraught, and they're like, don't know what to do. And so finally they get up, and they're like, okay, take the elevator up. And so they take the elevator up, and it's like hard ground, and like they open it and they come out and they're in the middle of a forest, like where Detroit was before. They come up and it's like a fully grown, like the Amazon, and they just emerge. And so they go on this expedition, and so they're out there looking, and they come across this fence, and they're looking at the fence, and they're like, it's like a huge fence, and it's like ancient, and it's like not built with modern technology. It's like an ancient stone and with steel and like all this stuff built together, and like rods of steel in this fence, and like vines at some spots. And so the one person, like the military guys, like they like get cut through the fence, and they get through the other side, and they're wandering on the other side, and they're like the fence is designed, the spikes are aiming like tilt one way, and it's like, this fence isn't for keeping anything in, it's for keeping something out. And as they're wandering through the woods, all of a sudden they get attacked by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and they don't know what the heck is going on. So they're like shooting and like throwing grenades, and this one guy just like gets scooped up, and he pulls a grenade as he's like getting eaten, and the grenade like blows up in the T-Rex's throat, and they finally stop it because their bullets can't. And they're like looking around, they see like a pterodactyl, and they're like, we gotta get through the fence. And so they're like scramble, and they're like get back, and they like close the elevator. And that's when they're like, nobody can leave, and that's when everyone starts rebelling. And so eventually they get up to the surface, and like after another couple months, the people rebel and take over, and they're like, no, you're letting us out. And they go up and they explore the inside of the fence, and they find this village of huts that are kind of like these domed huts made out of grass that totally aren't ripped off of The Hobbit, but look exactly like The Hobbit if you imagine it in your mind. And at the center, there's this like cliff that's like 40 foot around, and it's just straight up walls, just, and it's like 2 or 3 stories in the air, and there's a waterfall pouring off of it from every side, and a hut dead center on top, and then like a spiral walking, and a pond underneath, I remember. So they go up, and there's like this oracle lady, like she's the one who runs the village. And so Mason and Tyler and Desiree go up, and they speak with this oracle, and she's like, I have been waiting for you. And they basically discover that all timelines, like all of Earth's history during the nuclear explosion, is so violent and so much force that it actually crumbles time. And so like all these different times have ended up at this one point in time. So like you just have random, just like 10-mile square cutouts that just appear here. And whatever's inside of that 10-mile square cutout is now part of this time. And then it's like, well, there's a lot of things that we think are just myth and legend that were actually at one point on Earth. So there's things here that you think are only myth that have happened. And also there's like the nuclear radiation and stuff has also like changed creatures. And so like they're technically like 10,000 years in the future because they got cut out and put to the future with everyone. And so meanwhile, the characters don't know it, but I think there's a chapter from the villain scene, and it's basically like the devil or the devil's head demon is raising an army, and he has this sword that if he kills anyone with this sword, that person will become a demon. Like they'll be like, and they'll turn red, and they'll like literally turn into a demon. So he's like going around turning all these people, like killing villages, and then when he emerges, he's got like double his army. And so then he forges all these swords so that all the demons he makes have this same power in their swords. So there's this army of demons that whenever they kill something, they raise another demon. So they're just growing. And then to be cruel, because some people like get hurt but get away, they find zombies and they keep zombie blood with them, and they dip all their swords in zombie blood. And they're like, so that way, if anyone ever gets just cut, but they get away, they'll actually turn into a zombie. So they're like, no one survives our army, basically. And they're in this time too. And so then the Desiree, Tyler, and Mason has given this staff, and they're told they have to go to some mountain and find these other weapons. Like there's 4 weapons for the 4 horsemen. And they're like, you are the 4 horsemen, and you need to find these weapons. They've been saved for you. And so they're like, this staff is like a bow staff, but it's actually the staff of Moses, but it's been tempered and it's been reshaped to be an actual physical weapon. And so the baby's crying. Easy, baby. All right. So then they find the other weapons, which is, they also find Barnes when he comes out of New York, and he sees this demon army, and this demon army is like building towards New York. And so Barnes comes out and they run into him, and he reports like, if there is an army, and it's like headquarters is in Manhattan. So he goes with them to the mountain, and they find these 3 weapons, and one is like a giant sword. That's definitely not a ripoff of the Buster sword from Final Fantasy VII. And it also comes with 2 like attachable like swords that are like 2 foot long, 1.5 feet long. So it's like it has like it's one big mode, or it has like double mode. And then there's this scope that's like a viewing scope, and it can just see like a mile. Like it can see forever. It's like this magical scope. But it also comes with this like magical, like basically coconut, that whatever you put in it, you can pack it, and when you open it, it'll be like have an explosive in it. And then so the cowboy attaches the scope to his gun, and then he uses the compactor to make bullets, and then he makes bombs too. So he's basically got like grenades and bullets for his sniper rifle, which is like an incredible sniper rifle with the new scope. And Desiree finds this bow and arrow, and it's got 1 red and 1 green arrow with it, and that's it in the quiver. And so she puts it on her back, and it's like an X, and so she has this bow with 2 arrows. But what she does is, when she shoots the red arrow, it's target seeking. So when she shoots it, say she shoots this way at a corner, and her enemy's around the corner, it'll hit the corner, and it'll turn, and it'll hit that enemy. And if she hits the green one is if there's any living life, like a tree, she can shoot her bow into the tree, and it will take over the tree, and the tree will come to life and attack her enemies. So her 2 options. And then whenever the bow is done, it'll turn to basically dust and reappear on her back. So she can shoot it, and it'll reappear, and she'll shoot it, and reappear, and she'll shoot it. And then at some point, Tyler ends up going out and running in. There's like an incident with werewolves, and he gets bit by a werewolf, because when he gets the sword, he can't wield it. So by the end of the book, he gets bit by a werewolf, and so he can actually form into a werewolf. And when he's in werewolf form, he can wield the giant sword. So he's basically this giant sword, Buster sword wielding werewolf. And then the main character, the staff of Moses, the bow staff, he can fight with it, but he also, like, when he throws it, it can turn into an eagle, or if he wants it to turn into an animal, he can throw it in, like, at one point he turns it into an eagle, and it like attacks his enemies. Or if he wants it to turn into a snake, he can throw it. Or if he needs, like, say he needs to unlock a door, he could like turn into a snake and it could go into the door and unlock it from the other side. And so armed with this, they realize this army in Manhattan is just getting out of control. And Barnes realizes there's something in Manhattan, in like where he woke up. He's like, there's something in the building that can like nullify the weapons of the demons. He's like, I remember there's a crystal or something that if you break it, or Desiree's weapon turns out to be the angelic creature from the beginning that told Mason he's the one. And so Desiree's basically bow and arrows like form into that woman from the beginning, and they're like, it's you. And she tells them like there's a crystal where Barnes woke up, like, and he's like remembers it in the room. She's like, if you break, like, the demons are in Manhattan guarding that. And like, if you break it, you can kill the power of their weapon, so they can't grow their army anymore. She's like, and then you just have to finish off the army on your own. So they're like, okay. So they get together with the armies. And meanwhile, there's a short cutout where these cowboys like run into like this zombie horde. Like when they first cut, they're like confused, and they basically kill these zombies. And they're like really fast because they all have pistols. You know, no one's unarmed. So there's no, like, it's basically like, yeah, zombies never stood a chance, but they're dead instantly. So they're trying to figure out where these zombies came from and where everything was. And so they get together with all their people, which there's like Union people and there's like Confederate people. And they're like, we need to investigate. And like, they're all old soldiers. And they're like, we need to get our regiments back together. And we need to put on our uniforms. We need to get our military weapons. And we need to go like figure out what's going on. And then at some point, there's like, they run into like Roman soldiers. And so everyone gets together, and these Marines, the ones that fought the Tyrannosaurus Rex and that were in the tunnel, they all get together and they're like, okay, we have to go to Manhattan and we have to destroy this thing, and we have to, this like crystal, and we have to destroy this demon army. And so they're like, okay, let's get all our armies together and let's like surround Manhattan with all these armies and then go in and fight them. And meanwhile, you four with your special weapons will put you in and we'll destroy that crystal. And so the main characters actually have like these like, you know, like lions with wings. I call them unikings, but they're like griffins. So they have these griffins that they call unikings in the book. And they're like, we'll take these and we'll fly right to the building, and then we'll go in and we'll destroy this. And then they're like, okay. So they get these unikings. Meanwhile, all the armies get ready on the ground, and the military's got enough gas to be like, we can fly a fighter jet in like 4 or like 2, maybe it was just 1. They're like, we have a fighter. Okay, I think it was, they have 1 fighter jet and they have 1 Huey helicopter. And they're like the double-bladed helicopter, actually. And they're like, we have enough gas to run this 1 jet and this 1 helicopter for like 5 hours. And they're like, so we're gonna have jet support and 1 chopper support and all of this. So they're like, okay. So they're like, everyone pick a street. And they're like, the Roman army is like the most massive. So they're like, you guys get these 4 streets and you just do a phalanx. And you're going to fight this demon army with a phalanx. And every time they scratch you, everyone's going to be infected with zombies. And then everyone who dies is going to rise as a demon. And they're like, Marines, like you get that street, there's going to be 30 of you. You're going to be fighting like a never-ending horde of demons. And they're like, Civil War, like the Union, like you guys get this street. The Confederates, you get this street. And you guys are just going to be like, you have a battle line. And then they're like, okay. And they're like, also like the werewolves, like, they're like, there's like 15 werewolves, and like, you werewolves are gonna hold another street by yourselves. And like, and also to help distract, we're gonna drop like a mixed army in the middle of Central Park, and there's these giant boulders, and they're like, we're just gonna drop like 50 mixed, like there's gonna be 3 or 4 werewolves, there's gonna be like 5 Marines, there's gonna be like 10 or 20 Roman soldiers, and there's gonna be, you know, like 5 or 6 Confederates. And you guys, your job is, everyone's gonna be marching towards these armies. Your job is to piss them off in the rear enough so that they start swarming you, and then you can hold this giant rock, basically king of the hill, in the middle of the central square, and hopefully you can provide some relief to them. And when it gets too overwhelming, we'll just fly the helicopter in and just lift as many out as we can. And so they must have had a couple helicopters, because they had enough to get the people out, and they're like, okay. And like, meanwhile, while all this distraction's going on, the 4 of you, Mason and the 3 others, you 4 horsemen, you're gonna fly to this building, and you're gonna break the diamond so that every death is permanent, and they can't keep rising us into demons. So then we can dwindle their army down. And so as they're flying in, they run into demons on dragons. And earlier they do realize that the demon army has dragons. So they fight with their weapons, with the sniper rifle and the arrows and stuff, on the backs of these lions, flying lions, the unikings, and they're fighting these dragons trying to get into the city. And meanwhile, the fighter jet is kind of doing strafing runs and bombing runs, and like the fighter jet like takes out one of the dragons for them. And they end up like, they can't quite get to the building, so they drop like a block away and run into the bottom floor. And so they're like fighting their way up the stairs the hard way. And all these demons are like coming to the bottom, and so they're like just holding the staircase as they're like slowly backing up, trying to get up. And they're also like fighting the demons that were already in the building, because this is like the main headquarters. So as the 4 of them fight their way up, you know, all these different battles are taking place, and it's kind of jumping to all of them. And so it's a pitch battle, and they get to the room, and they destroy the crystal, or whatever it is. I don't know if it's destroyed. I think they have a crystal where they can like absorb the main demon or the devil, whatever it is, absorb their soul, and then that will take away their power. And then the angelic being that's in the bow and arrows can take them away. And that's where the power of all the swords lie. And so they're like, finally get on this top floor, and they're just like backed up, and they do it. They succeed. They stop the army. But they're like the whole army's coming up the stairs, and they're just like basically pushed onto the roof level. And I think they have this crystal, and like if they give the crystal back to the demons, they can just break it open, and then it'll be as if nothing happened. And so they're like just fighting, and they're like on top of the roof, and they end up back to back as the whole roof becomes full with demons, and they're just using the bow staff and the weapons. And I think the cowboy, he makes pistol bullets too, so he's shooting his pistols, and they're all fighting, and they're going down hard. And it's not like they're just overwhelmed on the top of a skyscraper with endless demons coming up, and they're just back to back at this point. And then one of the Huey helicopters just like pops up behind them with their machine guns and just starts unloading on the crowd of demons on the roof. And so they turn and they like dive into the helicopter, and the helicopter flies away, and then they get away. And then Central Park gets overwhelmed. So then all the Hueys come in, and they kind of evacuate these guys, but then the main four like flying on this one helicopter like through the streets of Manhattan, and like I think a dragon's chasing them, so they're trying to shoot it with their machine gun, and they eventually, you know, get out of there. And at the end of the day, they're like save it, and then the armies just dwindle this demon army down to nothing, and then they like, I think they encircle Manhattan, all the armies, and decide that they're gonna kind of starve the army out instead of fighting on the streets. So as the demons like come straggling out, they can pick them off piecemeal. And so that's how they kind of like, they win the day. And then when that's over, the characters just kind of go back to the village to kind of live out in peace in the village. And they have a campfire and they sing songs and they drink beers. Because I was 18 when I wrote it. So they just throw a party with a bonfire and they live happily ever after. Let's see. Let's read the last paragraph. Let's see. The moon was full and larger than ever, floating peacefully in the stars. Mason watched it for a while before he finally closed his eyes and fell asleep. And lived happily ever after. That is Apocalypse Theory, The Sword and the Staff, today, if you are looking for it.